Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Writers Drinking Whiskey, your literary happy hour, the show where two writers show up to their high school reunion at Hellgate, and even the Satan agrees you guys have had too much to drink. I am your host that always BYOBs, William R. Hincy, and joining me today, I am honored and thrilled to have Keir Graff with me. Keir, welcome to the Whiskey Bar.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, and we're really delighted to have you. So I'll give you the brief intro. And feel free to add anything I might have missed because you have a long illustrious career, and there will also be the description box on the YouTube down here somewhere with the full bio on there. But so the macro of it is you've had thrillers, mystery, contemporary fiction for adults, and you do a lot of adventure novels for younger readers.
Yeah.
The recent works are The Three Mrs. Wrights and Drowning with Others, both under the Linda Keir pen name, and I'll get to the Linda here when we mention the latest book here. And then with James Patterson, you co-authored the middle grade mystery Minerva Keene's Detective Club.
That's right.
And then solo, you have The Tiny Mansion and The Phantom Tower are some of the recent.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't need to read them all.
Very good. And then other notable things you've done. So you're the editor of the anthology A Million Acres, Montana Writers Reflect on Land and Open Space. And your co-editor with James Grady, who put us in contact here today. With my favorite thing of the show is it's like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. So I love getting down those degrees. What you co-host with James Grady, and that's the crime fiction anthology Montana Noir.
Yeah, one of the most fun experiences of my writing career was to work with Jim on that. What a wonderful man.
Yes, he's a super great guy, and I'll link his episode to this. But yeah, the first time I've ever met him, just like the first time I'm meeting you on this, and just an hour and a half of great conversation, and you feel like a better person, at the end of it, which isn't hard for me because you're starting so low. And I was like, I'm sure after this, I'm like, I'm marginally better, And then the latest book is The Royal Game. So those with the Linda Keir, that's written with your writing partner. It's Linda, and I should have went over this name, Linda, with you. Linda Hull?
Linda Joffe Hull, yeah.
Linda Joffe Hull, perfect. And then you guys write that together, and that's the pen name for that.
Yes.
Anything else I didn't skim over there you'd like to mention?
That pretty much covers it. I mean, I'm a little bit of a dabbler. I have a podcast that will be probably announced by the time this airs. I organize an event in Chicago, kind of an occasional meetup of writers called Publishing Cocktails. It's more than just writers. It's kind of anybody who has anything to do with words, slinging words in Chicago. So we have everybody from, authors and booksellers to publicists and publishers and editors and agents. And I've been doing that for about a dozen years with my friend Javier Ramirez, who's the owner of the excellent bookstore Exile in Bookville. But yeah, I like to keep busy.
Very good. Very good. I know. And I have lots of questions about it. So like I mentioned to you pregame, like you have a really wonderful, and actually I suggest for everyone to read it because it's just really funny. And it's a wonderful testament of persistence. You did a nice long bio you have the short bio, medium bio, then it goes long bio, and it's really funny. And you kind of go over every failure writing wise you've ever had and make fun of it and things. And it's really wonderful. We're going to cover a lot of that. Like you did this show for me. I'm like, look, I can just harvest from this. So it's going to be super great. So
well, I'm so glad you enjoyed that. I do think it's really important to be honest about the failures because some people can get disheartened from that, but I think it's really important to know that, everybody at whatever level they are in the writing game, I'm not the most successful writer you're going to talk to, but I'm probably somewhere squarely in the middle, but, I make a living at it and it came at a cost of a lot of failure. And I think it's important to be honest so that other people know that first failure doesn't have to knock you down,
Yeah, amen. I love it. And it's one of my favorite topics, actually. Sometimes I'm like, do I talk failure too much? But it's where you learn, right? Is where you learn who you are, where your mettle is, where you learn craft, where you learn whatever it is you're trying to do.
All the good stories come from failure, right? The success stories are never great. And then I made $1 million, and bought a mansion. Like, that's not a good story.
Exactly. Awesome. So then my favorite question of the day, what are we drinking?
Well, I'm about to be drinking a Remember the Maine, and I'm going to assemble it hopefully very quickly on camera here. So this recipe comes from Charles Baker's Gentleman's Companion, which is this is a first edition, 1944. It's a slipcased edition, so you get volume 1, which is entitled Being an Exotic Cookery Book, and volume 2, which is Being an Exotic Drinking Book.
Very cool.
This is one of my faves. I have a modest collection of old drinks guides. And but I actually first encountered this cocktail in a wonderful bar in Milwaukee called Bryant's Lounge. And a funny aside there, I was in Milwaukee to do a book club event, went to Bryant's Lounge with the book club afterwards. It's an amazing bar. They don't have a menu. They ask you, what do you like to drink? And so if I think what I told them is I said, well, Scotch neat and, bourbon in a cocktail. And they just kind of looked at me and said, okay. And they've got these kind of rotating, I don't know exactly, these carousels with bottles in them. They kind of spin them like gunslingers or something. And they mixed me up a cocktail. And I said, this is fantastic. What is this drink? And they said, it's a Remember the Maine. So I forget how many Remember the Maines I had that night. But I was crashing on my friend's couch after the book club, and I'm tweeting about the bar. And then the bar owner tweets back at me and says, hey, are you Keir Graff from Missoula, Montana? I said, yeah, I am. Turns out the guy went to my high school and now owns this bar in Milwaukee. So, talk about 6 degrees of separation.
Right,
Anyway,
awesome.
Let me mix this up. So this is a rye cocktail. It's kind of a variant of a Manhattan, like a like a Red Hook or something like that. So I'm gonna make a double and keep it in my little insulated cocktail shaker here. So for one portion, you want to do 1.5 ounces of rye. I'm gonna go ahead and use Rittenhouse bottled in bond.
Oh man, I wish I had known you were doing Rittenhouse, because do I still have some? Because I'm going to be making this with you, because I'm super excited about this. So
this is going to be a very potent cocktail, but this is what I had on hand.
All right, I'm going to make it with the rye I had with me, because I think I finished the Rittenhouses. Is the issue here?
That's a problem. What kind of rye do you have on hand?
I found this at the Total Wine near us. It's called St. Liberty's Josephine's Flathead River Straight Rye Whiskey.
I can't say I've had that before.
I've never had it, but I love the story when I picked it up, because I'm from West Virginia. I was born in Morgantown. My dad was in the Air Force, so we traversed the country.
Yeah.
But I always loved the moonshiners, because you still go back, right? There's just hills, and it was just people making whiskey. And so she was a famous bootlegger. During what was it? She had something that was really funny. She had a secret cabin. Oh, and then when the trains would go by, they would whistle for how much they wanted. Oh. So it was like 2 whistles was 2, whatever the amount was, 3, and then
let's just say gallons.
Exactly, whatever it happened to be. So when I saw that, I was like, "Oh, this is the rye I'm going to."
Fantastic, yeah, love it.
So you said 1.5 of that?
Yeah, so 1.5.
All right,
and then you're going to want sweet vermouth. I've got the Boisser, which I actually it's kind of my preferred vermouth these days. I usually find that Martini and Rossi sweet vermouth is just the best all-rounder for a cocktail. I know some people like fancier vermouths, but I think the fancier ones, you're kind of wasting them by throwing them in a cocktail. So,
sure.
So 3/4 ounces of sweet vermouth. And again, I'm doubling up just in case this conversation runs long.
Very good. You're smart.
Here's where we get esoteric. We've got the cherry heering, which is a cherry liqueur. And that's going to be 1 teaspoon. So we don't want it too sweet. I feel like I'm Julia Child or something. I need to pitch my voice up a little bit. And then the last liquid ingredient is a little absinthe or absinthe substitute. I've got this St. George. Somebody neighbor gave me a little bottle of this. It's not bad. I often use Herb Saint for an absinthe substitute.
Sure.
Good New Orleans product there. So 1/2 teaspoon. Just for a little taste. I'm a big fan of just a little taste of absinthe in a cocktail, but you don't want to go too far.
Yeah, I've heard of people started to like rinse the cup with it, where you just put it in like a dry martini or something, where you put in the dry vermouth and just swirl it around and dump it. I've heard of people doing that with absinthe nowadays.
Yeah, it's a strong taste, and so if people don't want too much of it, that might be a good way to go.
Mm-hmm, sure.
I'm going to get noisy for a moment here. I'm going to go ahead and shake it up. And I like a coupe kind of cocktail glass for the old-fashioned effect. And the garnish, if you know, some recipes on this will call for a brandied cherry. I disagree. I think you want to go with what Charles Baker recommends, which is a little lemon twist. So for those watching at home, hopefully you have all these implements and ingredients.
Yeah. Well, what I'll do is if you send me the ingredients again, I know the liquors. If you send me the amounts with the show description, I'll paste it in there. Anyone wants to follow along, they can grab all of it and make a splendid cocktail.
I hope we make some more converts. It's a terrific cocktail, in my humble opinion.
I believe it. I'm excited. I'm gonna put my I don't have a lemon right here. Anyone that's watched the show knows I'm very prone to an old fashioned. If you just leave me to my own devices, there's going to be way too much old fashions. Like sometimes a problem, but
that's kind of the way we treat Manhattans in our house. So it's just the go-to.
Right. Yeah. And Manhattans are really good too. I'll that's when I'll mix it up, but I will try this out and we'll put it there. Cheers.
All right. Well, cheers to you.
That is really delicious. I like that a lot.
Glad to hear it. I'm watching your face carefully.
I got one of the fancy absinthe dispensers. You just drip the water over it and things. Yeah. I love the custom of it. The kind of the ceremony of it. I don't love absinthe that much though. It's black licorice, right? If anyone hasn't had it, it's a very strong black licorice flavor. And my I tend to like spicier things or stronger drinks. So this black licorice, liquid one, I don't love as much. I have it. It's right on the bar here because it looks awesome with the green fairy holding up the water dish and things. So it's fun, but it's I rarely use it. I like to do it when people come over and then they can go drink the absinthe. And
then you can slowly get rid of your absinthe.
Exactly. Except for what I need for cocktails like this. So
about 24, 25 years ago, I used to write a drinks column in a Chicago weekly called The Designated Drinker. And I remember back then, everybody was, absinthe was big news and everybody's always trying to get their hands on a bottle of absinthe, but it was still illegal in the US for specious reasons. But the stuff that you could get wasn't real absinthe. So you'd get this kind of neon green crap from Eastern Europe and everybody would gather around ooh, absinthe. And it was just insanely strong liquor that didn't actually have the right taste, but we didn't know any better.
Right. Yeah, I believe it. Now you can go, we got some at the Renaissance Fair actually had it. And right when we were walking out, they're like, oh, you want absinthe? And we're like, it's usually just beer and ale and things there, right? What do you mean? Yeah, exactly. You get your mead there. And they give you the herbs. It's like a packet of herbs. And then you put those with, you can do it with bourbon, which actually I like a little bit more. If you do it with the bourbon, it just gives it more nuance to things. Yeah. It kind of it reduces a little bit of the black licorice and you just get a lot of the herbiness and things to it.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and you put that, when I already mentioned I'm from West Virginia, so we have mason jars. So I put that in some bourbon, mason jar, and you leave it for 30 days or whatever, and you get your absinthe that way. But I didn't have any. I actually have 2 of the packets. I just haven't spent the 30 days to make it yet.
So if you're from West Virginia, but you leave, are you obligated to bring your mason jars with?
Absolutely. Well, I always say that I was born in Morgantown. Until last summer, I would tell people I've never actually been to Morgantown, which sounds contradictory, but I was born there, had no memories. I mentioned my dad was in the Air Force. When I was a baby, we moved to Omaha, Nebraska. Some of my early faint, little flashes of memory are there. And then we moved out to California, and we've been out here ever since. So we've been in the shadow of LA for, 40 plus years, I guess now.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
You're
but I always,
Californian.
yeah, exactly. I always tell everyone, because even with genetically, because it's like the one side that's very clear is my dad is half Italian. His parents, you don't have to go back very generations to it's just my great grandparents were born in Italy. So that line's pretty easy. Everyone else, though, it's just a mismatch of, mostly British Isles locations.
Sure.
Because we moved so much, I never really felt connected to a place or to like a particular people. So I always joke that I just always feel like a guest at the party. It's like I always get invited, but I'm not really expected to clean up.
Yeah.
So it's kind of awesome. I go to West Virginia. I'm like, I'm here. I'm part of the party. And no one expects anything of me. And I'm like, all right, I'm off again. Where in the world are you, and where is the best place to get a drink there?
Wow. So I am in Chicago, Illinois. I'm originally from Missoula, Montana. And Jim and I have the Montana connection in common, obviously. But I've been here so long, I now have dual citizenship and 2 passports. My wife does notice that when I go back to Montana, I round off the end of my words more than when I'm here in Chicago. Best place to get a drink in Chicago. So I'm a regular at the Globe Pub because I'm a huge soccer fan. And I'm a loyal, long-suffering fan of Aston Villa. And the villains gather at the Globe Pub on Irving Park Road. So I'm there most often. However, they don't make the best cocktails as much as I love them. It's more of a beer bar. So Larry's, which is a bar on Lawrence Avenue, is, I'm going to say, my favorite cocktail bar in Chicago. It's just an excellent Manhattan. It's a really cool vibe. It's this little hole in the wall. It's this funny building that Uptown, we're on the edge of Uptown, and Uptown was in the sort of 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was actually known as Little Appalachia. There were so many kind of poor whites came to Chicago because they were seeking opportunity. And when we first moved to Chicago many years ago, you would actually occasionally hear like a rich, deep drawl from the haulers on a porch on one of the side streets. Not so much anymore. But at any rate, in the 1920s, it was this glamorous neighborhood full of these buildings covered in gleaming terracotta, and all the singles would live in Uptown, and they'd go to these dance halls and roller rinks, and Al Capone had a club there and all this stuff. And then it had like a 10-year heyday and then like a 50-year decline. And so one of those grand old residential hotels became one of the saddest looking old folks home you've ever seen. I used to walk by it all the time. And then at some point they sold out, somebody renovated it, turned it into little tiny flats for young people. So kind of like back to the history. Right. And then they opened this little bar off the lobby. It's, I don't know, maybe 15 feet by 20 feet. It's pretty small. But it feels like a hotel bar because it is off the lobby of the apartment building, and all these cool young people, with many of whom have dogs, go parading back and forth with their dogs and their tattoos and their cool hair. And so we like to just sit there and drink a high-class cocktail and just kind of people watch. It's a great bar.
Right. That sounds great. I'll have to remember that next time I'm in Chicago. I used to have to go out to Chicago for work fairly often, and my wife would meet me up for the weekend. And we love just, traversing downtown and things, because LA downtown, like every time someone says, I want to go to LA, they don't mean they want to hang out in LA. They want to like be in the LA area. They want to go to Beverly Hills or Santa Monica or the beach or wherever. So Chicago is really fun because you actually get the city feel, when you go down.
Well, next time you're up here, let me know. I'll take you for a drink at Larry's.
Very good. Very good. I will hold you to that. I just have to get work to want me to go there again. So I'll find a reason.
Yeah.
So I mentioned um, the wonderful bio you have on your website, and that'll be linked here too. So anyone who wants to go to your website, they'll be able to and find the bio. One of the parts that immediately struck me that I thought was hilarious is that you went to a high school called I alluded to it in the thing, Hellgate
I
High
noticed.
School.
Hellgate High School.
Yeah. So and you started writing there. And you mentioned that pretty hilariously on there as well. And I think that's a pretty common thing. I think I started writing about like in earnest in high school, not but in earnest, like you find that you want to be a storyteller.
Yes.
More deeply, I think, around that age. So what are the reunions like at Hell's Gate?
Boy, I haven't been to a reunion for a while. The last one was, I don't know, it was like 2 weeks before my annual family visit, and I wasn't going to go twice or something. So it's been a while since I've been to a reunion, but the last one did look great on Facebook. People floated down the Little Blackfoot River, and they, it was a golf outing and a picnic and just all sorts of fun. I mean, Montana's very outdoorsy, and Missoula it's in a valley, and I grew up 2 houses over from a mountain. People didn't even really think of it as a mountain in Montana, but it's definitely by Midwestern standards a mountain. And we grew up playing on that all the time. Our parents would come out and just yell at us when they want us to come down for dinner. And it's just a very outdoorsy place. People are very connected to being outside. And so, I think when people, the alumni of Hellgate, go back there, it's like partly to be in town, but it's mostly to be out of town, to be, get back in the hills and do stuff.
Right. I think that's funny because I did notice that. And for anyone that has been, California is very mountainous, right? I mean, you'd go, the Sierra Nevadas, obviously, but then there's, the where I am now. If anyone's watched the Rose Parade or the Rose Bowl, they always show the mountains behind Pasadena. Those are the San Gabriel Mountains. I'm just traversing down those San Gabriel Mountains 10 miles from Pasadena, which is also in the foothills, I am, just a little further away. So there's mountains everywhere. When I'd go to Indiana when my daughter was living for a bit, and when I'd go to Chicago and even Wisconsin when I was out there, it always struck me how flat it was. And they'd be like, "Oh, the mountain," and I'd be like, "Where's the mountain?" They're like, "It's over there." I'm like, "That's not a mountain. What are you talking about?"
Yeah, Illinois is one of the flattest states in the country, and it still amazes me that I ended up here. But we have steel mountains downtown. So.
You do, yeah. This is very true. So then, you mentioned in it, just traversing along your kind of author journey here. So you went to Hell's Gate for high school. You went and got I think it was your bachelor's. And then you decided that you didn't want to keep pursuing on for like your MFA or whatever it might have been at the time, because you didn't want to, and I'm going to quote now, earn my living as a working writer, not some tweety, out of touch academic. Which hit my heart. I really loved that. So I'm not trying to put you at the spot like that. That spoke to me. Could you take us on that journey a little bit?
Yeah, you bet. So as you said, I'd kind of always been a writer. I mean, I think I really fell in love with writing when I was 5 years old, and I dictated a play to my father called Zorro and the Bad Guy, I remember. And he typed it. And I just remember seeing my story typed, like it looked very professional. It was a page and a half long, but I think honestly, that was probably the moment I was hooked. And then in grade school, I would make little books, like literally assemble books by gluing cardboard covers into like fabric wrappers, and then, like sewing pages together and assembling these whole things. And the first one was a class assignment, but I was so hooked, I kept doing those. And so I would, write the story and draw the pictures. That was probably, 5th and 6th grade. And then high school, I happened to go to Hellgate High School at a really golden time. My father was a teacher there, and he was an English teacher, and his friends were all the English teachers. And it was kind of coming out of the 70s. I mean, I was a high school student in the 80s, but it wasn't this whole like national standards curriculum. There was a lot of winging it. And these were some really smart, interesting teachers who created these electives that were engaging. My father taught filmmaking. I mean, he was teaching high schoolers about like
That's
Sergei
awesome.
Eisenstein's theory of montage. And he used to do like a 2-week unit on Picasso's Guernica. And one of his friends taught a class called the detective novel. And I took that elective as a senior. And it was cool because we read some detective novels. They weren't like amazing, like honestly, God, what was it? We read a couple really formulaic, pulpy detective novels, but the cool part was that he challenged us to write our own detective novels.
Sure.
And he said, well, if you write a chapter a week, you'll have a short novel after a semester. And most of the kids were like, are you out of your mind? And I was like, wow, that sounds really cool. And so I did my best, and I didn't finish my novel by the time I graduated, but I kept working on it, and I finished it, 3 or 4 months after I graduated. And it was absolutely terrible. It was like, it was, I think it was kind of a ripoff of like, oh God, what was that? It's William Hortzberg novel that was adapted into a movie with like Mickey Rourke and I should have this at the tip of my tongue. But anyway, I'd seen this kind of supernatural, kind of noirish film. I didn't even know about the book at the time. And I had also read a lot of Anne Rice in high school, as you do. And so I wrote this just pretty crummy, detective novella about, the client turns out to be a vampire or something like that. But I finished it, and then I started writing another one a couple of years later, and then I did, another one. And, I wrote and, self-published like 3 novellas. And when I say self-published, I mean, I made copies at Kinko's, because that was my first job out of college, was working at a Kinko's. But, I went off to college at Hampshire College in Western Mass, without even considering a career or even considering my major. I just like, well, I'm going to be an English major, right? Because I like to read and I like to write. I didn't think about what it would mean after graduation. And I was in for a rude awakening, because this was kind of like the height of the PC wars. And like the very first class I took was, very eye-opening. It was like literatures of colonialism. And, I had grown up in a household where like we read Joseph Conrad as, being a great writer. And then, here I was, a hayseed from Montana, be confronted with the idea that, well, there's a different way to read Conrad. And I think, there's some validity to that, of course, but my experience of that was that the first semester, I just felt like, oh my gosh, they're just tearing down my literary heroes. And they're saying these guys have no redeeming value whatsoever. And, I took a class in Foucault where I felt like a total bumpkin. I remember being like laughed at by the teacher, because I was struggling to grasp some of his arcane concepts. And so, it didn't get off to a promising start. But what happens is I started taking literature classes at Mount Holyoke College, which is part of the 5-college consortium. So even though I was paying tuition at Hampshire, I could take classes anywhere I wanted. And I started taking literature classes. It was taught a little more traditionally. And the dean of the English department, William Quillian, kind of took a shine to me, and it really instilled in me a love that persists to this day of some great classic, Victorian classics, and he was a huge D.H. Lawrence guy. I was a real big Dickens guy, but I really loved writing papers for him. And it turns out his wife taught at Hampshire College, and she became my advisor for creative writing. So very interesting marriage, because they kind of diverged on their approach to literature. But Quillian encouraged me to study literary theory as a graduate student. And I just thought, the vocabulary around that makes me want to kill myself. Like, this is not how I want to write about writing, because I even then really believed in plain spoken writing. To me, I love a great stylist, but I don't consider myself as a writer to be a great stylist. I almost want the words to disappear on the page so that you can absorb the story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I continued, I did some writing, and I actually, because I went to a non-traditional school, I was able to write a novel for my thesis, which is kind of amazing. And I took some tough knocks with that. My tough minded advisors, I remember Lynn Hanley, Bill's wife, telling me that, because I was trying to write about somebody who had a really boring summer job, and she said, "Do you know what mimetic fallacy is?" And I said, "No, what's that?" She said, "Well, it's when you're trying to tell us something is boring and you've made it boring." And I was like, "You need to cut about 150 pages out of your 300-page novel."
Right.
So I took some hard knocks, even,
So she introduced you to the novella. She was like, you gotta.
Yes.
Let's get this down.
But, I came out of that with kind of a tough skin. And honestly, I'm really glad she didn't hold my hand too much, or didn't,
Sure.
didn't praise me in a way that I didn't deserve. And I certainly didn't at that point. But yeah, at that point, I was kind of falling out of love with academia. And I had this totally misguided notion that I was capable of probably selling a novel within a year or two that would and start earning a living, which is just, I mean, it's good to have misguided confidence, because if you didn't have it, you probably wouldn't start.
Sure.
But yeah, again, more rude awakenings were in store. I left
can we
college.
go?
Oh yeah.
Can we go back a little bit, actually? Because there's a couple of things that struck me. I don't want to miss them.
Yeah.
One of them was the difference between your high school education and then when you went to university, which was high school. When you were describing it, it was, here's this class, and we wrote a novel, which is amazing, actually, because you talk to so many people. My wife used to tease me, because she'd go, "Why don't you tell more people you're a writer? We go out and you just don't tell them, Yeah. I tell them a little more now because I have the show, and I'll kind of point them to the show. But before, I used to not say it much, because I'm like, you know what? Because every time they're going to ask me about my writing, only because they want to then tell me about the great novel they're about to write. They're probably never going to write that novel. Yeah. And part of the reason they're not going to write it, and I say this to her, but part of the reason they don't write it, because they don't see the steps. They've never done it. So how beautiful a gift for that teacher to have had you do it in high school, to where it wasn't this mountain you had to climb anymore. I've done that before.
Absolutely.
Something to completion. That's not the challenge. The challenge is making it good, right? But this is I know how to do it. And then to go to college, to where it sounds very, very different from what you're describing. It was more dictated, which I think nowadays you think differently, but I don't know that it's so different now. Nowadays, the school is very there's the No Child Left Behind, and they're very, you have to know to read by this age, or you're going to be left behind, and that's a catastrophe. So you stress the kids and the parents and the administration, and everyone's just stressed to make these arbitrary dates work. How was that for you?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was just asking how, was that part of was that cause any difficulties with you, or any?
I think I was still headstrong enough and self-confident enough that, I didn't feel too beaten down by the change. And in some ways it makes sense. Younger kids should just be encouraged to just create. And then, a college student is an adult, and adulthood is a time when it's sort of okay, you're going to have to work at this. And so I think the lessons I generally took were good. I think I got a lot of good support for my writing, even though, my advisor was tough. I did get support and time to write in college, which was amazing. I think that, my experience with literature was a little more up and down, just with the kind of culture of reading at the institution and at the time I was there. But yeah, it worked out. One of the sad things about Hellgate now is that they don't have electives. They got rid of electives because it was this whole idea we can't have, these awesome things for the kids who are excelling and then hold back, so everybody's kind of got to hit the same mediocre, limit. And I struggle with that. I mean, certainly you don't want to deny the kids who have more learning challenges opportunities, but the kids who are really ready to go and learn and excel they're going to check out if they can't be challenged.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I struggle with that a little bit in college. I struggled with the formality of school, the structure of it. It was when I was going to school, not too much later than you, but I was high school in the 90s.
Yeah.
And it was so structured, and it was go do this. And I remember at one point a teacher, because I did like 3 weeks of assignments because I'm like, I just want to get them done. I'm just going to go do these. They're all easy. You can't do them. Well, why can't I? You have to do it in this order. But I'm like, but are they wrong? Like, is there like, no, it's all fine, but you have to do them in this order. And it was like but I have these thoughts. So there was you got to let a horse run a little bit, right? You got to like let people be who they are a bit. So that's what we did. My son was homeschooled for a bit, partially because of that. He went to a Montessori school, which in France, that's the idea, is to let kids learn and adapt on their own. But you actually can't do it in earnest in the States because you still have to, they still get tested. And if they want to get their state funding, they have to make sure you meet these. And so my son was struggling to learn to read a little. Reads fine now. This is years ago at this point, but and it was like, oh, so he's at this Montessori school we pay for, and then we would send him over to this tutor, and then we try to read with him at home. And it's just stress. So it was just all this stress. And then once we took him out, and I was just homeschooling him, and then I was just trying to make it fun for him. We would learn sight words, and like I would make a silly story through the whole thing. So I'd use whatever word. Once he said it right, I would fit it into this ridiculous improv story we would do. And he learned really quick, and he was fine. And he's doing well now. But there's that not understanding people learn at different paces, and you need to let some people sprint here. You need to, and even those kids challenge, that are struggling, there might be other things that they're really interested in that they could feel great at. And if they're successful at it, that might help them with all that other stuff, right? Like, I'm a great artist. I feel really good here. Well, now I can work on math or arithmetic and reading, whatever it might be. So.
Yeah. And even as grown-ups and as writers, we learn at different levels, right? It took, I now know a lot about the business of publishing, but I think in some ways I was kind of a slow learner. It took me a lot of books.
Sure. Yeah, I believe it. So, and the other part that made me laugh about your bio was that there was I think you started with novellas, right? I think they're kind of in that length. Yeah. And then you're like, well, they didn't make me rich, so I'm going to move to Austin. Which was so funny when I was reading that the other day. We do open bar episodes of the show now, where I bring back former guests. Yeah. And it's like 3 or 4 of us. And we talk mostly like writing craft and things. Yeah. But kind of a author panel at the bar, kind of attitude. And I was cracking up this last time because one person goes, yeah, and you think you're going to make billions. And the next person's like millions. And I'm like, we're all like working writers here. None of us are making millions and billions. Like occasionally, maybe you get lucky and you make millions. You're definitely not making billions. And the idea that we're throwing these numbers out is very funny, but you get that, right? Like, I didn't get rich doing this, so I'm going to move to Austin now.
Well, so I often tell the story, my very first book that I sold, it was an unusual sale. It was to Five Star Mystery, which is an imprint of what's now Gale Cengage, used to be Thompson Gale. And they're a huge textbook publisher, and they publish legal databases and all this stuff. But they had purchased this little Maine-based book publisher of fiction. And they had Five Star Mystery, and they had Westerns, and they had a couple of genres. And I got the offer through a book packager, which is kind of unusual. And his deal is he takes half the money. I mean, okay. So my cut was going to be $1,000 for my first book, Cold Lessons, which I published under a pseudonym. And I said, okay, that's fine. I was so anxious to be in print. I wasn't going to wait. I know some people say, wait until you get the perfect deal. I was just like, yeah, give it to me. I want to publish. And I said, the one thing is I'd like you to make the check for $999. And he said, well, we can do that, but why? And I said, well, look, I just want to be able to look back and say I sold my first book for the high 3 figures. And I figured, there's nowhere to go but up from there.
Right. Very good. That's hilarious. It reminds me of my wife and I, this was, maybe almost 10 years ago, probably not quite, but we were buying a car. And my wife's Chinese, and then if I can get the numbers right, 8s are good, nines are good, sevens are very bad. So they're going to sell us the car, and it's an expensive car because when we got married, we're very mine, hers, his situation. So I had two daughters. She had a daughter. We got married. We had our son. Well, she's pregnant with our son, and I'm like, look, we don't have a car that fits all of these kids. And she's like, oh, so she had a Mercedes, and she has to like sell her Mercedes so we can buy a minivan. Right. So
that's a tough moment in any woman's life.
Yeah, exactly. She's kept this pearl like in her heart this whole time. Like I had to sell this, when we got together to get a minivan, Now we have a minivan and she loves that. She wants to drive it all the time. But fast forward to the time we're gonna do it. And she's like, okay, so I want to go get this BMW. And it has the third row. At this point, my girls were the oldest ones. They're starting to drive and things, so they're not with us all the time. So we need the extra seats, but we don't need them 100%. So
sure.
I'm like, look, you want to do it? We're doing way better than we were. You want to go get the car? Fine. Like, up to you. We'll go do it. So we're there, and then they give us the price, and I forget. It's 48,888 or whatever. Yeah. No, it's sevens because it's the wrong numbers. Okay, so yes, it's 47,777. She's like, oh no, can we make that 48,888?
I bet that was a first.
Yeah, she was like, I'm like, we're not going to pay more. She's like, no, we're going to save, like, we can't use that number. That's a bad number, She's not very superstitious either, but there's those certain times, right? You're like clicks in, and I'm like,
I mean, maybe it's worth paying a little extra for peace of mind, right?
Right. We pay it just like it's worth getting paid $1 less to say you got paid in the high three figures, and which you did. There's the bit in Austin. And then you decide that you kind of vacillate between being a rock star and being a filmmaker that scores his own, films, screenwriter, kind of proper writer, whatever you want to call it, writer of books. So what's the connection with all those? Is it just storytelling, or was this just
the other connection is be like unrealistic expectations and a large ego. I don't know. I have always been a huge film lover. I mean, as I said, my dad taught filmmaking, and he brought home Super 8 cameras when I was a kid. And so I used to make little Super 8 films, and I'd round up the kids in the neighborhood and make movies and screen them and stuff like that. And I was a huge film fan too. My dad would take me to the local rep theater and show me stuff like Kurosawa movies and things when I was a pretty little kid, but I loved them. I mean, my favorite movie to this day is Lawrence of Arabia, which I saw at a young age on a big screen. But I was also a kind of a tragic dork in like middle school, and then the summer before ninth grade, like two things happened. Like I got contact lenses and I joined a band, and my life changed in high school, like immeasurably. And I continued, I love, I was a songwriter and guitar player and singer for a number of bands, some cover bands, but eventually started writing original music and playing original music, and continued to do that for like a dozen years. In fact, when I went off to college, my brother had taken a gap year so we could start a band. And then we took the band back to Massachusetts because he was going to school down the road at Amherst. But I think that like, I didn't want to give up anything. I wanted to find a way to do everything. And I had this grandiose idea that, somehow I would like write movies, direct movies, score the movies. I mean, there are people who have that much talent and work ethic. I think that I fall just short of that much talent and work ethic. But that was certainly my goal. And yeah, I think you're right. The thing that bound those together is it's just storytelling. So I was never a lyricist for the songs. I've probably written a couple hundred songs in my life, and I didn't write out and out story songs, but I didn't write just those weird cryptic oblique images like, REM used to or something. Sure. I would try to convey a story in some sense. Sometimes I would write a song, a lyric from a point of view, and then people would later say, I can't believe you're like that. And I was like, that's a character. Like that's a time-honored songwriting tradition, is to write as a character. And then obviously like screenwriting, I spent a lot of years knocking my head against the wall. Really, I mean, the part you're alluding to where I was like, well, I'm not going to get rich, selling my novel. And then I was like, well, I'll just do it writing screenplays, um, which is hilarious. But
Yeah.
I studied it very seriously. I wasn't just like half-assing it. I read all these screenwriting guides, and I obsessed. Anytime I could go see a filmmaker's talk, I would go. There were a couple of brothers from Montana, John and Rick Dahl, who actually made some great movies, including like The Last Seduction and Red Rock West. And they'd come back to Montana and talk, and I'd drive across the state to go listen to them and ask them questions. And I ended up writing probably a dozen screenplays kind of from my 20s to my probably from my mid 20s to my early 30s. And spent an enormous amount of time trying to make a sale. And it's tough when you're not in Hollywood and you don't have any connections. Sure. I had a couple of close calls, and in fact, in my 30s, I wrote a play and directed it here in Chicago. And then a guy that I'm now friends with optioned it for $1 and secured financing. And we were going to make an independent film. And then we lost our funding when the real estate market crashed. But we were casting. It was read by some actors that I really admire. And we actually had one TV actor who people have heard of, like attached to it. And so a lot of near misses. But, to me, I think that what ultimately pushed me towards novel writing and away from being in a band and screenwriting, as much as I loved those things, is that, and as much as I love collaboration, I really love collaboration. And I hope we can talk about that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
To make a movie, you need a lot of money and you need a lot of people. Even to successfully gig with a band, you need at least 3 or 4 people to like show up on time. And the thing that finally broke the straw that broke my back musically was just that I would assemble a band, write material, we'd rehearse it, and then inevitably like the bass player would quit. And I wanted to be able to create something on my own. And that's what sent me back to novel writing. I had done some, I had been working on a book in my 20s, and I went back to that and finished it. And it was the book that ended up being called Lessons and my first sale. But I just ultimately thought, you do still need a publisher, but I can at least create the book by myself. I don't need 4 guys and amps. I don't need microphones and cameras and actors. So that's ultimately why I kind of recommitted to prose.
Sure. Yeah, no, I understand that completely. And I do want to talk about the collaboration, because I noticed there's a lot of collaboration, right? Like in your writing. So
yeah.
I did have one final one before we, well, actually I shouldn't say one final one. I say that all the time. Every time we go out to eat, actually, and I get my old fashioned or my Manhattan, and when the waitress comes, I'll say, I'll have one more. That it's not one more. It's however long we're there more. But I always say one more. Like we're getting close to the end.
That's here. Okay. We can have as many questions as you want, or you can cut me off at any time.
So all of that inevitably leads you. There's a really funny quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but it was basically like, to be a screenwriter, you need to be a freelance writer to support the screenwriting. And then freelance writing, you need a real job to support the freelance writing that supports the screenwriting. Yeah. And then that eventually led you to Booklist, yes. Where the corporate world where you thrived realistically for a bit. Maybe you could take us through the Booklist time just a little.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It was like a cascading series of like misunderstandings about what would earn me money. And I think as a lot of liberal arts majors spend a lot of time thinking like, how can I earn money? Like literally, I just had no idea how to earn money for much of my young adulthood. Nobody had really explained to me how that worked. I mean, I worked a lot of crummy jobs. I knew how to make an hourly wage and did a lot of that, but like money, I didn't really have so much of a grasp on. So in my early 30s, let's see. So my wife and I moved to Chicago in 1996 and from Montana. I had fallen in love with her. She had fallen in love with Montana and didn't want to leave Montana. But I was like, I can't grow old in my hometown. And so I convinced her to kind of audition a couple cities with me. And we went to Austin first, which is where I was planning to move for the music scene. and then decided not to move there, and came to visit a friend in Chicago who we loved it. Third night, we decided we're moving here. We went back home, gave our notice at our jobs, and started making plans to move. So we moved here, and I worked at a Kinko's for a while, because that's what I knew. That's what I had been doing post-college.
Right.
Not the worst job if you're a writer, because the free photocopies, man, you can copy your work, and it's true self-publishing.
Right.
But I couldn't take that for long. And so I quit to go on what I call wife support. I got really serious about my screenwriting and worked very hard at that while I was developing my freelance career. And that started slowly. My first year, I probably made a few $100s, but, it was starting to become sustainable by around 2001, which is when we had that .com bubble burst, and I lost a lot of my freelance just overnight. And just suddenly realized, like, I got to get a job. And a friend had told me about, I'd never even heard of this publication, but a friend told me he knew of an opening at Booklist. And Booklist magazine is published by the American Library Association, and an institution that I was to become intimately familiar with. I was hired as an editorial assistant in not the cool part of the magazine, but what was then known as Reference Books Bulletin. And as you know from reading the bio, like, I would spend my time checking in books like the 4-volume Encyclopedia of Meat Sciences. There's just some weird books out there.
Right.
But the cool thing was the publisher, Bill Ott, who died last year, just a huge loss. He's a great guy, and really mentored me and became a true friend. But he had noticed my resume come through, and he said, this guy seems like he's a little overqualified for this, because I had, I'd done a lot of writing, and here I was, a 33-year-old editorial assistant, or however old I was at the time. And so he asked me if I wanted to write book reviews, and I said, yeah, of course. And so that was kind of my way into the rest of the magazine. And for people who don't know, Booklist is one of the 4 pre-publication journals known as the trade journals that are still influential. They used to be more influential, but the whole business of publishing is changing, obviously. But they used to be huge in terms of generating early orders for books. Publishers Weekly, of course, is the big one, and that's kind of for the book selling trade. Kirkus Reviews, nobody could ever figure out who they were really writing for. I think that their original idea was that they were going to sell summaries to busy, like, film executives. Any rate, whatever, they're one of the other ones. Library Journal and Booklist were the 2 that were for the library market. And librarians, of course, don't have time to read all the books they order, so they read our reviews. So instead of writing like a long New York review of books style review, a Booklist review is about 170 words, and it's just kind of quick and to the point. Like, what's this book like? Is it successful? Who wants to read it? And Booklist, we reviewed about the height of things, probably almost 7,000 books per year. So we read and reviewed a lot of books. And that was a crash course for me as a writer, because I think one of the best things you can do as an aspiring writer is to be a reader. I constantly meet aspiring authors who don't really read that much. And I don't understand, for multiple reasons. Like, they don't want to contribute to the ecosystem that they want to be a part of, but also, how do you learn to write if you don't, how do you know what to emulate if you don't read other writers and go, oh man, I wish I could do that. But reading on a deadline and reading a lot was such an education for me, a very different education than my college education, because to quickly read and summarize something, you're just trying to figure out, like, does it work? Does it not work? Why doesn't it work? How can I explain that? It just absolutely invaluable. And so I stayed at Booklist for, I think, almost 18 years. I was the first editorial assistant to be promoted to senior editor. And then I helped launch the website Booklist Online. And then eventually, when I left Booklist in 2019, I was the executive editor of Booklist. So I was the second in command there, and I left to write full time. But it was such an amazing experience. And also, I got to go to, Book Expo, and I got to go to, like, big conferences where there were a lot of writers, and you meet people in publishing, and you just learn how the ecosystem works, which again is really useful. It's so hard. I remember coming to Chicago and just saying, like, I have no idea how and I knew there were publishers in Chicago, and I just didn't know, like, where's the door? Like, how do I get into this?
Sure. Well, it's like, and I'll hear my daughters say this because they're in their early 20s now, even hitting mid 20s. But every job's like, oh, you need experience.
Yeah.
And there's always that chicken and the egg, right? Like, how do I get the experience that you need me to have? And so almost
they want you to be a independently wealthy person who can take an unpaid internship and get the experience while providing a service to them. That's what they really want, which is
that is really what they want.
Which is why publishing is #SoWhite, you know?
Right. Well, yeah, it is. I mean, it ends up being that chicken and the egg all the time, but there's ways you can do it, right? So I think sometimes it's figuring it out, as you go, as you've articulated there. The other piece, there's two. One, you had a really funny quote, which was, you can't sell out until you've sold something. So to where I want to ask, are you at the point now where you can sell out, or where you have sold out? Are we good now? Like, are you there?
Well, it's funny. I think younger me would probably think this dude's a sellout. The two most recent projects I did were, essentially works for hire. And yet, maybe it's because I have college tuition bills to pay, or maybe it's just because I'm older and wiser. I just don't see, I don't feel like a sellout, because to me, the goal is to use your craft to tell stories and find readers. You can be the best writer in the world, and if you don't have a reader, it's great. You can still write to entertain yourself, and that's important. Everybody should entertain themselves first. But at the same time, I think we all really get into this because we want to share it with somebody. And so I'm very fortunate in that I've been able to, in my career, write books by myself and kind of for myself that were then published, writing books from my own ideas, but also to kind of take some commissions. The new Linda Keir novel, The Royal Game, was actually an idea that was brought to us by Alloy Entertainment. And they're this, subsidiary of Warner's that, helps create literary properties that they then try to turn into like TV shows. And they've been very successful at that. They don't all become TV shows, but so they kind of look for the right writer for a project, and they say, hey, would you like to write something like this maybe? And they pitched us on a romantic mystery that's based loosely on the Meghan Markle and Prince Harry story. And I will tell you, I'm the first to say that I never would have come up with that on my own, or really even had the interest to do it on my own. But I was a freelance writer for a long, long time. And I do like an assignment. In some ways, a completely blank page is the hardest thing. If you tell somebody you have infinite time to write whatever you want in whatever form you want, and just knock yourself out, take 10 years if you want, and then bring it back. I think for most people, that'd be sort of actually paralyzing. But when you put some kind of constraints on it and you say, well, it needs to be 80,000 words and we need it in 9 months, and it should be about kind of this, it should be a little bit like this, you still get to put a lot of your creativity into it. But I find that I work well within constraints. And so that ended up being a ridiculously amount of fun to write, even though, again, we had to do some deep dives and learn a hell of a lot about the royal family, but the research is interesting. And, dysfunctional families are great for fiction, right? And what family is more dysfunctional than the House of Windsor? Come on.
Right. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Oh, I think that's a great point. I think of it quite a bit is that creativity, we like to think of it like it exists outside of the bubble, right? Outside of the box, right? Oh, you're in this box. But if you watch kids play, oh, the floor is lava. And then now you have to be creative about how you go about the house, right? Like having some constraints actually forces you to be creative. I think Hollywood has gotten themselves into this a little bit. Their budgets are too big, because back in the day, if you listen to like Jaws, the shark's not working. So now they have to be creative. So the only reason the shark doesn't show up all the time is that the mechanical shark wasn't working. And that ends up instilling so much more dread, and it works to the advantage. So forcing you to be creative, in these constraints can actually lead to really amazing things. Without constraints, it can lead to just flailing, right? I mean, just flail around. So
Well,
I can see that completely.
we put limits on our children, and at some level, we creatives are somewhat, childlike, probably. So it's probably good for us to have limits and bedtimes and all that.
Yeah. So you mentioned publishing and cocktails. And I simply must know about this in general. So can you maybe give us the 411? Well, and for anyone under 25, 411 is what you used to call. Like if you wanted information you would call 411, it would give you information on the phone number. So that's why
sometimes you would have to dial it, on a rotary. Anyway, dating ourselves.
411, yeah.
Yeah. So I was, let's see. Yeah. Before I think Publishing Cocktails has been going for 12 years now. And a year before that, I had been running a very small gathering I called Editors Night, the monthly gathering of editors I knew. Pretty small group. But I mentioned that to a friend of mine who said, "Oh, you've got to meet my friend Javier. He does something kind of similar. He gets booksellers together, and he's been inviting authors recently." And he told me about that. And then it took me forever to actually meet Javier because this friend kept being too busy to introduce us. But I finally went to one of Javier's events. It was an absolute blast. He's a career bookseller and just knows a ton about the business. And he was just taking young booksellers under his wing and then inviting authors to these events. And it's really mutually beneficial because the young booksellers love to meet the authors. The authors, of course, any author who knows what's good for them should make friends with booksellers. And it was just a really fun event. And so we hit it off. And then we said, well, why don't we combine forces and then maybe make it even a little bit more broad? So we conceived of this thing, Publishing Cocktails, where it would be sort of, the idea was that anybody who kind of draws a check, they don't have to be full time, but anybody who kind of makes some money in the world of words, because we wanted people to be able to talk shop, and nothing against the unpublished authors who need a leg up and all that, because, I certainly do a lot of talks and we want to provide resources for people like that too. But this event was really for people who work in the business to let their hair down and talk shop and not necessarily be pitching each other, because we didn't want people to come and, like, if there's an agent there, we want them to feel comfortable coming and know that somebody's not going to thrust a manuscript into their hands. And so we really invited, as I was saying earlier, kind of, authors, booksellers, editors, agents, librarians, a few journalists, publicists, marketing people tend to be really fun. And Chicago doesn't have, we're not New York, but we do have a decent publishing scene there. We've got Source Books is the biggest publisher in the Chicago area, but there's some really neat little indies. Some of them are like little micro presses, and some of them are, kind of moderate, like Agate Publishing in Evanston. And kind of, we now have a mailing list of over 500 people. And we used to be better about meeting kind of every other month. It's gotten a little more sporadic because a couple of years ago, Javier and his partner bought a bookstore, Exile in Bookville. Fantastic bookstore. Anybody who's coming to Chicago should absolutely visit it. And so then he became so busy running author events at night, it's been harder to get him to come to our own events. And then my career's really been a little nuts in a good way lately. So we've been more sporadic. Last year, we probably only got together 3 or 4 times, but I still try very hard to keep it going. And I've had people tell me that, I just had no idea there were so many people like us in Chicago. And I think it's really important to, like, if I look back to when I arrived in Chicago and I just thought, I don't know a soul. Like I had, one friend here and then my wife, and I just thought, like, where is that community? And so now I want to help create that community.
Right. No, that's awesome. I think there's that bit of it, right? The creating community is it feels like it vanishes beneath your feet half the time, right? It's like, oh, your social media community, all of this, and that's fine. But it's not the same. It's not the same as getting together. And actually, even this, like, the chance, like, what I love so much about this show is the chance to get it to meet people. Like, I always call it a labor of fun. Like, I get to, like, just meet people like I didn't know. Like, so, sometimes I've heard of the people, sometimes not, but, like, I'm very, like, just open because I'm like, every stage of the career, I just we can talk
Yeah.
shop, we can talk life, we can have fun, you can build community, that way. So,
Well, and one of the things that aspiring authors can do too, like, that I think is one of the best things you can do for your career is to meet as many people as possible that are in the business, but to do it with a spirit of just genuine, like, just open your heart and just open your mind and just meet them. Don't be selling them. Don't be pitching them, because when you make those friendships, then good things will happen. But I'm fortunate to be at a point in my career where I guess some people kind of perceive me as somebody who could be helpful to their careers, and I can tell the difference when somebody's trying to pitch me and somebody's just like,
sure,
let's get to know each other, right?
and that's what I tend to think. Like we had mentioned, I think on air as well as off air here, the whole 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, which is the whole show is made is all 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, right? And that's all I do. I just get to meet people. I get to have a great conversation. I feel like at the end of it, I've always learned something. I've always kind of had my mind expanded in some way.
Yeah.
And had a lot of fun doing it. And so
you have
look at the
best idea for a show. I mean, cheers to you, my friend. This is, it ticks a lot of boxes.
It does. I'm running low on my old fashioned here, but I will meet that cheers. And I finished it was the Maine.
Remember the Maine.
Commemorating
the battleship that was sunk to start the Spanish-American War.
Very good, very good. I forgot the remember part, which is very me. So to sum all that up, there was 2 questions I wanted to ask you. One is, what has all that taught you about just persistence in your life, like the value of it and such? And maybe just start there. I'll ask the second one after, because when you ask 2, I'm going to forget the second. But
well, I know I'm not the first person who said this, but there's a lot of talented people in the world, and the difference between the talented people and the successful people pretty much is persistence. Like, I know I'm not the most talented author out there, but I am one of the most persistent authors out there. And I guess, was it Woody Allen? Maybe we're not supposed to quote Woody Allen anymore, but like, I think he said, like 90% of success is showing up. And I really believe that, like, and you can interpret that in a lot of different ways. It's not just like showing up to work. I mean, that is the first most important thing. You need to show up to your desk and write. But you also should show up for other writers, right? And show up at their readings. If you expect people to come to your events, you should show up at their events when you can. Showing up for the people in your community, but just like being there and maybe you could also interpret that as like being present at these things you're doing, like showing up as your authentic self and not showing up as some kind of like, grifter who wants to make a connection. And, because I mean, when people, we've kind of already covered this, but like when I meet people who think they're getting into writing to get rich, I mean, there are easier ways to make money and to get well known, my friends, so like do it because you love it. And, I mean, Linda, my writing partner, we often say like, we'd be doing this stuff and going to these events, even if we weren't getting paid, because these are our people. Like, these are the people we want to hang out with, other writers. And, this is the work we want to be doing, and I did do this work before I was paid to do it. And I will continue to do it when they stop paying me to do it. Mm-hmm. Showing up to my desk, even if, there's an audience of 1, but hopefully that's a long ways off.
Yeah, let's hope so. And what I love about that too, is it reminds me when, so I started this show and I'm a dad of 4. I really did, like, I write all the time. I have a day job, all these things going on. I'm like, but I had this idea because I'd done a few podcasts, and I don't want to disparage them, but they were just very similar, and very, I'm just trying to sell you something. Mm-hmm. And I'm not the I'm trying to sell you something kind of person. I know a lot of writers aren't. And I'd go do these writer events, and we would go out for drinks after, or just, during, and we have all these great conversations, all this camaraderie, all this like fun. And I'm like, well, why isn't that the show? Like, that is what like drives me to this, is that's the community. That's the enriching part. And so I started doing this, and it is because it's a 1-man shop, like, at this point, it's a ton of work to do it.
No
And
doubt.
so, yeah, and so I remember one episode, I will never mention it, because I wouldn't want to put the writer that was on with me down. I'd mention if it was just me and make fun of myself, but I felt like I wasn't there. I wasn't present. That I was like, okay, I'm going through the motions. And when I had to edit that and look at myself doing that, I like the shame. Like I could hear myself, like all the versions of my conscience going, shame, shame, like throwing nuts at me and things, tomatoes, whatever, when you're in stocks. And that was a real telling moment for me, because I was like, you know what? No, I don't care who it is. Everyone, this is the opportunity. Because I treat my writing that way, but I didn't treat the show that way at the time. Like this is, even if one person watches, and we've been lucky enough with the show to have the varying degrees of success, but I want to always treat it like it's one person watching, and that's the person I'm committed to, and I'm not gonna like lay you down. I'm gonna like try to be there. I'm gonna try to do this the best I can.
That's being a pro. I mean, professionalism is showing up and treating, like you hear about, musicians. I mean, like as authors, we've all had the book event where like, it's an embarrassingly small number of people, right?
Sure.
And the difference between a pro and, to me, I don't know, an amateur or a prima donna maybe is that the pro walks into that reading with 3 people and doesn't show that it's phased them in any way. They give it their full energy, show their full appreciation for those 3 people who did make the effort to show up. I mean, making 3 fans is not nothing. To me, that's not nothing. So if you can win 3 people over, it is well worth putting out the energy and making that connection.
Right. Yeah. Amen. Awesome. And then the last thing on that, I like to ask kind of generally, but especially I like to ask funny people. And like everyone's humorous to some degree, but kind of the witty people on here, is there anything that haunts you? Is there something, because a lot of times, right, you get that humor, like I know with me, like and I've said this at conventions and such before, but a lot of my writing, the inspiration is trauma of some sort that I'm dealing with. And so, yes, I tend to be, try to be funny and things. There's a bit that's a deflection mechanism for a lot of us, not everyone, but for me, certainly. Is there anything with you that haunts you, and it could be more general too. It doesn't have to.
Yeah. Well, I am so extraordinarily fortunate in that I come from a loving home where my creative whims were indulged, and my parents did split up after I was an adult, but like the whole time I was a child and a young adult, things like I didn't face any adversity, no trauma there, and so I didn't become a tortured artist. I became a pretty happy artist. But the first thing that jumped to mind is when you said what haunts you. I was like, oh crap. So when I worked at Booklist, so the American Library Association is a not-for-profit, and they have, the salary, because it's not-for-profit, the salaries aren't amazing. They're good, but they're not amazing. But you have really nice benefits, right? You have excellent health insurance and more time off than people normally get, and the workday is 1 hour shorter, which is amazing. 1 hour.
That is amazing.
Yeah. However, I spent an extra 20 hours a week reading books for work, so it wasn't exactly like, But anyway, the actual time in the office was 1 hour shorter. But one of our amazing perks was like an academic perk. They offered sabbaticals, and I was like, "What? Can I have a sabbatical?" And so I applied for a sabbatical after I'd been there a pretty long time, maybe 10 years or something, and I was granted a sabbatical. So you could take, I don't remember how many months it was. I think you could take X amount of months at half pay or X amount at full pay. And I want to say it was like 3.5 months at full pay, which is unbelievable. Like
That's amazing.
What a gift. And I mean, honestly, probably every employer should offer them to their professional employees, because if you've been there I think you had to work there for at least 7 or 8 years before you could even apply. But, come back refreshed and recharged, maybe you're a better employee. So I applied for it. I was granted a sabbatical, and my plan was to write this novel that had been percolating in my consciousness. And, I'd published a couple novels by that point, but like I'd been writing them. My first handful of novels, I had like an hour a day to write. I mean, you can relate to this, right? Like, working dad. I would get up early. I would write for 1 hour before I went to work every day. I would write extra on the weekends if I could, but when your kids are little, sometimes you struggle to get that time. So I was just thinking like, I am going to outline this book and I'm going to write like this. I'm going to really bust my butt and write as much as I can of this amazing novel that's in my mind in the 3.5 months that I have allotted to me, that my employer is gifting to me and my coworkers are like, covering for me. Like, how amazing. And I wrote my butt off. I didn't waste that time, but I don't know what happened. I took a wrong turn. It was crap. It was like the one book length thing I've written that I just think is just like, is it even salvageable? I don't know if I can go back and reread it. I was so fired up with this idea of doing something big and grand that instead of doing what I usually do, which is kind of much more disciplined and, build it more slowly. And I was just like, I'm just going to let it all flow because I want to write as much as I can. So I think I wrote like 50,000 words in 3.5 months and realized at the end of that, very near the time I had to go back to work, I was just like, this is just not working at all. And I now have to go back to work and I don't have time to fix this and I'm too embarrassed to tell anybody what the hell happened. So that is my trauma. That's my trauma.
Yeah. Funny. Well, it's one of the questions I like to ask. And so I think it's going to dovetail. So I'm just going to like ask it now because I like to ask, like, what's the biggest kind of failure in the writing sense? Is that it then? I
think that would have to be it. I mean, we've all, every writer who's published books has, books that maybe didn't perform commercially as well as you'd like or anything. Or projects that you just didn't feel like you pulled off as well as you wish you had. And, maybe after it went to press, you sort of realized like, oh, wait, I should have, and it's too late.
Right.
But nothing, yeah, I don't think I had any other kind of, fortunately, no like public failures like that. I mean, I've had some bad reviews like anybody. I remember my second novel that I set in Chicago was my first novel under my own name. I was so pleased to come out with this. And I just thought, I'm really going to have Chicago on every page. And I'm really going to, try to use a lot of locations and just make this all about Chicago. It was actually a very dystopian novel, but set in Chicago. And as sometimes happens, the person who wrote a review for one of the local weeklies was like this, 21-year-old, like, intern who's like, the younger you are, the meaner you are, I think sometimes, because it's like you get a little older, you get a little more empathetic and you're kind of like, oh yeah, this shit's harder than you think it is. So this kid at this local weekly just pans it. It's like, oh, it's just so gratuitously set in Chicago. And then they even started singling out stuff that I had done on purpose as like mistakes. Like I thought it would be a real Easter egg to make the address of this one building actually in Graceland Cemetery. So I made up an address and then they're like, and these addresses don't even work. They're not even real places. It was just like for this person, nothing works. So we've all been beaten up a few times, but I don't feel that book. I think it was a respectable sophomore effort. I'm still very proud of that, but it's the book that I didn't think through well enough to finish. That feels like my failure. And also too, the fact that I still feel guilty about the fact that my coworkers had to work harder than usual while I was gone. I mean, I did it for my colleagues when they had sabbaticals as well.
Sure.
So
yeah.
we helped each other out, but that's the one that really bugs me.
Yeah, I get what you mean. Cause then it's like, you all help each other out, but it's like you went to accomplish something that you didn't accomplish. And so now you feel like, oh, they had to help me out for something I couldn't even do, even though they didn't even know that's what the plan was.
I couldn't even say 2 years later, and here's the book that you guys helped me out with, I had nothing to show them, fortunately people were pretty, I published enough in general that I think people were kind of like, I don't know, maybe they just let it slide or whatever. But yeah, the manuscript is still around here somewhere. And it kind of, it feels like this kind of like voodoo doll lurking around the apartment.
Sure, sure. The cursed doll, like sitting there. Just let's transition then to a bit about the writing before we get to the reading. Are you going to read from the Royal Game today?
Yeah, I guess I will. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Awesome. So we'll get to that, but maybe more generally, especially with all the editing credits and things, I really wanted to pick your mind a little bit about the writing craft and everything here.
Sure.
Specifically because I did notice there's so much collaboration
Yeah.
in your profile there. What is that like? So maybe we can start with the Linda Keir series, the Royal Game being the latest one, but I know you guys have written, not that they're a series, but you guys have written more under that
Sure.
that pen name. What is that collaboration process like?
Yeah, well, so Linda and I met at a writing conference in Chicago and just kind of, as you're saying, like the best conversations are always in the bar. The best part of any conference is the bar. And so that's why you're wise to recreate it here. We're at the bar. So we met at when I actually met a few other writers who are now still good friends of mine all these years later. And then we met again at another conference. We met at BoucherCon in St. Louis. And we were describing, like, we were talking to an agent who didn't represent either one of us. And she just said, "Oh, what do you want to work on? What's this next thing you want to do?" And Linda said, "Oh, I recently learned that some swingers moved into my neighborhood, and it kind of blew my mind. And I've really been wanting to write about swingers, but like I feel like this is a very serious topic." And the agent said, "Well, what about you, Keir?" And I said, "Well, this is really weird, but I just watched a documentary that made me then read a book about swingers, and I want to write about swingers, but I think it's really funny." and and so this agent says, "Well, you guys should write it together." And we kind of looked at each other like, "Oh, I don't know about that, like that. What?"
Sure.
And on the other hand, when an agent tells you should consider something, you should probably at least give it a little thought. So we talked about it at the conference, and then we made a plan to have a phone call about it a couple of weeks later, and we talked about it some more. And then I think we just kind of ultimately decided, like, well, maybe that would be an interesting way to stretch as writers. And so we decided to give it a try, but we felt that the only way we could make it work would be to have a detailed outline, because we just, there's no way you can pants a book with two writers. You can't just be following your muse and then like, does this match up with what you've written? So our system was then, and still is pretty much today, to write different characters, so alternating points of view. So in that first book, I wrote the husband, she wrote the wife, and then to have a very detailed outline so that we would always know the roadmap. So we spent 7 months outlining this book, and we had almost a 20,000 word outline when we were done. So we really had broken the story multiple times, and we knew how it was going to work and where it was going to go. And it changed a few times, but not massively. It changed more in nuance. And then we just started kind of writing. And I'm here in Chicago. She lives out there in Denver. Full disclaimer that we're both very happily longtime married to other people, and we are not members of that lifestyle. But as writers,
just the literary swingers, if you will.
Absolutely, there you go.
My thing around, yeah.
But as a writer, it's like I was talking about how like a dysfunctional family is a great source of conflict. As a writer, I'm always interested in subcultures that have their own kind of rules and their own mores and stuff. And it's just like, that was really interesting to me. I did see a documentary about swingers that was like it's not what I thought it was. Like, I don't know what I thought it was. I guess I thought it was going to be like sexy young people who do this sort of thing, but it's mostly like middle-aged empty nesters because their kids are gone. And so this documentary was kind of like, I don't know. I mean, God bless them. People can do whatever they want. I am not here to praise or condemn that lifestyle, but it's just like, to me, it was so amazing because like these people would have potlucks and then they would all, like get together and, swing. And it's like, right. I always thought like, that's hilarious. But we ended up going in a more serious route, more the Linda route, because we decided that our route in for that story was going to be kind of like, well, we decided ultimately the story question was kind of like, what happens when you try to have it all, and can you have it all? And these are people who were trying to have it all. And there are some smaller groups of swingers that are younger people with younger kids and stuff. And we thought, our take on that was that maybe not such a great idea to do if you have younger kids around, just because even if you think they don't know, they're going to know, and it might have some negative
Sure.
effects on them. So we really tried to write a very serious story about, the consequences of what these two people do to kind of try to save this failing marriage. And our agent loved it. He was sure it was going to sell for big bucks. And it ended up taking a long time to sell because the publishers were like, well, wait a minute, what's going on? This isn't romance. And they're like, no, it's not erotica. No, but it's got a lot of sex in it. Yeah. It's like, do you ever remember that period of time, the distant past, the 70s, when there used to be serious novels that actually had sex in them? Like
Sure.
people,
Yeah.
like that used to be a thing, but now everybody was like, we don't know where to shelve this. We'd buy it, but we don't know where to shelve it. And
Right.
that is a publishing problem, and something that, again, aspiring authors should think about. Like, when you are trying to sell your book, the editor who's going to acquire it and then the publisher who's going to publish it, like, they need to know what shelf it goes on in the bookstore or the virtual shelf on Amazon. What are the, on Amazon or whatever,
Sure.
IndieBound, whatever. Like, there's more categories, but even so, like, where are people going to look for it? And so it took a long time to sell it. We did eventually sell it, and I'm very, very proud of that book. I mean, to me, it's a very serious novel. And from there, we just with each book, we've continued to explore something a little different. Our second book is more of a traditional mystery. Our third book is, marketed as women's fiction. It's about three women who discover they're married to the same guy and what they decide to do about that. And
Mm-hmm.
that was kind of, we were combining a couple of interests we had. Like, we were very, very closely following the Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes story. And so we made the guy the kind of male Elizabeth Holmes. And then, but he's also a little bit of a dirty John, if you remember that podcast.
Sure.
We were sort of like, the question there was like, throughout human history, there are people who have had secret families. How hard is it to have a secret family in the age of social media and Facebook? And so
Right.
we were trying to write about that. And then I kind of already explained the genesis of the Royal game a little bit earlier on, but our process has more or less remained the same. Different points of view. We work from an outline. I tend to be an up and at 'em early in the morning kind of person, so I get up and draft like crazy for a few hours. And Linda sleeps a little later and then walks her dogs and kind of likes to ease into it. But it's perfect because by the time she sits down at her desk, like, my chapters are there. And so she can read them and then go work on her chapter. And we just kind of go back and forth. And we've got, the one other thing I'll say about that collaboration is just that it really helps to have a collaborator who has different strengths, because if you're both good at the same things and bad at the same things, there's really no net gain, because
Right.
it's not, it feels like you're doing going into it, you might think you're going to do half the work, but you really don't. It's weirdly just as much work as writing it on your own, but
Mm-hmm.
it's more enjoyable because you have somebody to share the labor with. And
Sure.
so it helps to have different strengths and weaknesses, because then that makes your partnership greater than the sum of its parts. And so I was a professional editor, so I tend to be more the line editor and the language Nazi. Linda tends to be the more 30,000-foot view person, which is really useful to me because, I sometimes get a little into the weeds of a scene or a sentence even. And she's the one she much more frequently than me will go back to the beginning of the book and read through to kind of make sure the tone is right and the pacing is okay. And then kind of like characters' motivations are consistent and stuff.
Sure.
So, with those two things, it's been a very successful partnership.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. What's the drafting process like? So after you have it, you've written the chapters and everything, and then the edit, the second draft, third draft, whatever. Do you do the more the line editing and she does the big picture, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, we do a ton of work in just the brainstorming part, and that's, to me, honestly, my favorite part of collaboration is just the phone calls where it's a story. I mean, that's the
Sure.
best part. You're just like, what if, no, wait, what if, well, why would he then, like, I love that
Yeah.
part. But once we draft, we tend to go back and forth over each other's chapters a few times. And I'm definitely more the line editor, but, she'll, make comments in my sections and say like, well, this seems like it's in the wrong place or whatever. And you have to be very not precious about your work. I mean, we do have disagreements sometimes, but if there's something if there's something that one of us has written and we don't want to delete or whatever, the rule is we get to keep it and we let the editor decide, because eventually, there's going to be an editor someday, but our stuff is very kind of pre-edited. It's very clean when it goes to our agent and then to our publishers, because we've both gone over each other's stuff multiple times. And then because I am a very meticulous line editor, so we don't tend to get, I love editors, and I'm not one of those guys who's like, we don't get edited, because that's BS, but we don't tend to get edited heavily because it's very clean copy.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. Was it hard? Or did you have any pitfalls? Because there's especially with book writers, right? There's that I have complete creative control, right? Like this doesn't have to go through like you wrote a play, right? I used to do a ton of acting.
Yeah.
All stage, nothing noteworthy per se, but there's with every play, even if you're adapting Shakespeare or whatever it might be, right? The actors and everyone, the director of that play, they all bring something to it. Yes. So it's not that, but you write a book, well, it may get edited, and it will get edited in fact, but you're still mostly like you've gotten control of, the most control you can have of an art form, right? Really, like of any of the written ones. Was that difficult to give up some of that creative control, or?
Not too difficult for me, partly because actually it's funny that you mentioned playwriting, because to me, one of the most magical experiences among the most magical experiences I've ever had as a writer have been doing table reads of my plays and hearing like talented actors speak my words aloud, because they bring things that I didn't know were there. And to me, that's the kind of magic of collaboration, is like there's just something greater than me happens when we're working together. And yeah, there are times, we have to be honest, like there are times when we feel a little precious about our work, and it's, God, I'm speaking like plural first person. It's the whiskey, first person plural. So the royal we, there are always going to be times when I feel a little precious about my writing, but not too often, because I think that if you can just enter into a collaboration in a spirit of humility, you're setting yourself up for serendipity and great stuff to happen. The Royal game we actually wrote with, we are the two people who wrote it, but we outlined it. Instead of outlining it the two of us as normal, we actually outlined it with our agent and two executives from Alloy Entertainment, who are super smart people and have great commercial instincts. And to me, that was a dream. I've always wanted to be in a TV writer's room. I've never had the opportunity, but I would love to do that, because to me, if you've got smart people who are all about like letting the best idea win, my name is on the book in the end, or my first name anyway. And I guess you could say this to any aspiring author, is like, don't fight your editor so much, because if their idea is better than yours, you still get the credit, right?
Right.
But
right. Absolutely.
I'm being very long-winded about this, but it's like, it's not too tough for me, because I just feel like I'm all about, what's the best solution? And if somebody's got a better solution, and I want to recognize it, I would hate to be that asshole who is defending an undefendable position because it's mine. Like if somebody's got a better idea, I hope that I'm mature enough to accept it.
Sure. Well, and so much of writing is discernment, right? Yes. I mean, it's like it's you have ideas. We all have ideas, but to be a writer, you have to have that discernment of what needs to be here, what needs to be later, what makes more sense, And so I think that's a lovely way to think of it. I wonder then, so moving a little bit past the collaboration piece, I did want to get your opinion. For one, I mean, because your writing is noteworthy on its own, but I'd love to talk with editors about this that have worn both hats.
Yeah.
Speaking of both hats, one of the things I've always thought, and I don't edit. I would happily, if someone went to brainstorm, I would go over because I did do lots of acting. I love the playwrights, and actually, it's funny when you were saying that. It did remind me of for my short story anthology, Without Expiration. They did a cinematic book trailer for it, and then there's the audiobook. And I swear both the times when I watched those, it gave me other ideas that I wanted, like, and it's kind of too late at that point, but I had these ideas and I was like, oh, I see it. Like, it would be so awesome just to write something and have some actors come act it out for you and then edit, you know. It would be completely financial, like suicide, but it would be really awesome.
It would be cool. Yeah.
But I wonder, do you ever struggle with, and maybe not so much anymore since it seems like now you're mainly on the writing end, but do you ever struggle kind of switching hats between the I need to edit, you know, to be in editor mode versus now I need to be in creation kind of writer mode?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, honestly, I think sometimes I do. I mean, because I do a little. I don't have time to do much, but I do a little freelance editing, just because I like to kind of keep my hand in. You know,
Sure.
it's a skill I enjoy, and I want to kind of keep that muscle, like, you know, it oiled. Mixing my metaphors.
Like Arnold Schwarzenegger, like
I'm getting oiled myself. Yeah, but I think that's a really perceptive question. And I think it is something I struggle with once in a while. And I was sort of recognizing recently that I was writing more and more slowly, because I used to, back in the old days, 1 hour a day to write, I used to draft so quickly. I could sit down and write 1,000 clean words in an hour because, I mean, I've trained as a freelancer, used to meeting deadlines. But I also just knew that was it. That's all the time I had. And now that I write full time, I mean, it's not to say my days aren't full, but I have more time. And there's that whatever rule it is that a job will expand to fill the time allotted to it.
Sure.
I'm sure that the clever name for that. But I realized that I was getting more and more slow because I was polishing more and more. And so this book, so not the Royal Game, but Linda and I are drafting a 5th book right now, and we're over halfway and going strong. And I had to change the way I write a little bit to kind of try to recapture that spontaneity again, which is to really, some people call it the vomit draft, which I find such an unappealing term. But I now do something that I never used to do, which is to really just write a really, really quick and ugly first draft of a chapter. I used to go somewhat more slowly and try to kind of build it. And now I'm just like, I want to find the shape of it, and I want to do it as quickly as possible before I start thinking about what's wrong with this sentence. So sure. You know, your instinct is correct. Like, that is sometimes a challenge for me.
Sure. Well, and I've heard people describe it as the instead of thinking of it as a first draft, a zero draft, and you're just, it's, you know, it's the kind of, I think the same thing probably as the vomit draft, just like, just get it, let's get something on there. So you have something to work with, you get that subconscious on a page, and then, you know, sculpt away from there. And I wonder then, so maybe we can get a couple kind of craft genre questions here. So since you write, it's like thrillers and mysteries and things, I wonder, as far as the thriller aspect goes, there's that instilling of dread upon the reader, right? Like, how do you instill that dread? And I'm willing to go a little esoteric with this, in the sense of what are the tools? Like, what are the ways you go about accomplishing that?
Yeah, you know, to me, I mean, there's so many famous examples, you know, like what was it? Hitchcock said, terror is, showing somebody blown up by a bomb, and suspense is like showing the bomb strapped to the leg of their chair in a crowded theater. I mean,
sure.
Which is one of the best definitions I've ever heard.
Sure.
I think that it starts with characters you care about, because if you don't care about the character, it doesn't matter what you do them. You just have a Saw movie, right?
Right. Sure.
Who cares? Then it's just torture porn. So to avoid that, you have to quickly sketch a character that you'll care about. And in screenwriting, it became very fashionable to do, the save the cat model. It's just like, well, you have the one gesture that like shows that there's somebody you care about and whatever. And, okay. You know, I've literally seen some movies where people save cats, and I'm like, okay, you're taking that a little literally.
Right.
I think it's more than that. I think that you have to give your character some quirk or some weird little raw sense of humanness that the reader can connect to. You know, something that's a little off and odd about them that is, you know, the same way we're all a little off and odd. Um,
Sure.
so it starts with somebody you care about. And then, of course, you know, people, a bad thriller writer is just going to be like, well, what's the biggest bad thing that can go wrong? Well, an asteroid is going to hit the planet and everybody dies. You know,
Right.
that's far too abstract. You know, I think that you can create effective suspense. Probably, I haven't written this novel, but you know, you could have effective suspense with like a school teacher who, you know, is you know, they've been faking their lesson plans and their principal is going to find out or something. Like it's all about
Sure.
like relatable consequences and a feeling that somebody's about to get found out. But to me, the challenge of really writing effective suspense, and I'm not the best guy at it in the world, but I'm, you know, trying to get a little better with every book, is that you're always walking that fine line of keeping the reader, letting the reader be a little ahead of your character, and then sometimes letting them fall a little behind. If they're
Mhm.
always ahead of your character, it becomes like that horror movie where you're screaming in frustration, don't go out in the basement, you idiot. And if they're too oblivious, then you kind of check out, right? So they
Right.
need to feel at moments like they're a little bit ahead of your character and a little bit like, oh, I see what's going on. Ugh, because that creates this sense, this almost sometimes physical sense of dread. Like I see what's coming and I wish I could stop it and I'm powerless, right?
Yeah.
But you then have to let the reader fall behind and get a little bamboozled so that they're not constantly feeling superior to the character. And to me, it's this kind of, you can't, and you also can't do it every other chapter because then the rhythm becomes too obvious. So you
Right.
have, it's this kind of like playing with irregular rhythms of letting the reader get ahead and fall behind.
Sure. Sure. I love that. That's a great way to think of that. Irregular rhythms. That's lovely. I wonder then. I think in the similar vein, there's also like with thrillers, but I'm thinking mysteries. You know, specifically for this one, is there's the reveal, right?
Yeah.
And then there's like, you know, it's funny too because I heard a comedian talking about this the other day, and he was like a problem with a lot of modern comedians. And I can't remember the name. If I can think of it, I'll try to credit him at the
Yeah.
show notes here. But he's like, the problem with a lot of modern comedians is you know what their politics are. So you always know what the punchline is. Like you always know what the reveal is. And
Yeah.
so the great comedians used to always be
Yeah.
making fun of both sides. So you didn't know what their
Yeah.
politics were. And so you
Yeah.
didn't know what the joke was.
Well, one of the
And
reasons Dave Chappelle is so electric is people are always like, wait a minute, I don't know what's going to happen. Right. And
yeah,
a lot of
yeah,
people get upset with him or whatever, but I'm just like, but that is, I haven't seen him live, but like watching him do stand up is
yeah,
fairly electrifying because he doesn't like hew to one orthodoxy. And,
right.
you know, he's maybe going to offend some people, but that's part of the thrill of watching.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
So how do you manage that when you're writing a mystery, like the reveal? And I know it's a little different from comedy. It just struck me when they're talking, when the comedian was talking the mechanics of it the other day.
Oh my God. Well, traditional mystery is really tough. And I don't really, you know, I've written a couple of mysteries, but like most of what we do is kind of like what I like to describe as mystery adjacent. I mean, we do have, I would say that our actual mysteries that have, our books that have a real mystery are Drowning with Others and The Royal Game. And there are mysteries in those novels and there are, you know, clues and, you know, suspects and all that stuff, but not probably in a way that's going to satisfy a fan of Agatha Christie.
Sure.
But to me, like, I guess the reason I read mystery, I mean, this is going to sound like heresy or something. I don't read mystery for the mystery. The reason I fell in love with mystery was the characters and the setting. And I think that the reason that some of the most successful mystery series are successful is not because of the puzzle-like mysteries. I think those people forget what happened. It's because people want to spend time in that world.
Sure.
And so I'm kind of like evading the question here, but like, I really truly believe that most mystery fans, I know there are exceptions. There's like the 10% of hardcore mystery fans who really, really want a Playfair kind of traditional mystery, and God bless them. I mean, that's fantastic. Those are also really, really hard to write. But I think most people like the milieu of crime. They like the big question mark of an unsolved crime. They like the cat and mouse chase, of a detective and a criminal. But they don't care too much about the mechanics, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And my preference is on the big reveal to get it over with very quickly and end the story. However, Linda and I have noticed, well, I don't read reader reviews because it's funny. I was a professional reviewer for many, many years. I just kind of can't have reader reviews in my head. Like, I appreciate every single person who takes time to write one. I really do. Even the bad ones, I appreciate the effort. But going on Goodreads or Amazon, like I can't have them in my head. Linda finds it very interesting. So she'll share with me kind of the gist of what's going on.
Right.
And she says that we occasionally get dinged for ending our books too quickly. But to me, like, I don't like those big prolonged, like 3-chapter denouements where it's like,
sure,
like, oh, and then this, and then this, and then the epilogue or whatever. Because I kind of feel like, well, you reveal the mystery, like roll credits. So, sure. I to me, it's all about the anticipation and not about the elation of the resolution. I love, I mean, some of the greatest films of all time, it's like they end like that.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, I think that's, I love the way you put it because it makes it more, it's not so much the mechanics or like the how to, it's the who to, like the who's doing it, right? Like the person behind, like we got so this is the home bar, right? Yeah. And I'm always adding to it. My wife, God bless her, like she deals with so much. So I always have this like new idea, and I love like really like little unique things. In fact, I was just reaching out to like a woodworker the other day because he made like a Sasquatch, like a little, and I'm like, oh, that would be so perfect. But I need like a 2-foot tall one. Could you make me like a 2-foot tall one? That would fit so perfect over here. He's like, that would be 20 grand. And I'm like, well, never mind. Let's scrap the idea.
How about 2 inches tall? How much would that be?
Exactly. And so, but there was the woodworking of it was a barrel. It's an old barrel. You can go buy them at like Lowe's now. They'll sell the ones that you can't use to actually hold fluids anymore. People use them in the gardens or they make things out of them. And so they made a little shelf out of it. So that came the other day, and there was like 4 steps to putting it together. And as you can imagine, being a writer and a heavy drinker, like those 4 steps took me like 2 hours, right? But when I was done, to me, it's this big reveal, like, oh, that was like, and there was this one piece, I just forgot to take the screws out. It wasn't meant to be there. My wife's like, that looks weird. Why is that there? And I'm like, it's stability, And I'm like, no, she makes a lot of sense. That shouldn't be there. And I was like, oh, it's just these screws. I have to take these screws out. And that was a big reveal to me. And that meant something to me, like no one else. Everyone watching this is like, this guy's an idiot again. But with mysteries, right, it only matters to the characters. It matters to them. And if that's satisfying for the reader, for the characters happening, I think that's a great way to look at it.
I mean, kind of to the point of something you said a moment ago, it's like we call them whodunits, not howdunits, right?
Right.
Like we care more about the character, I think, than the mechanism.
What would you say the biggest risk is you've taken in your career?
Wow. Well, I think probably quitting my job to be a full-time writer.
Sure.
Yeah, it's, for a number of years, I had a good job and I liked my job, but I also, part of my job was celebrating the career of other writers. And while I very much enjoyed being able to do that, I loved being able to champion, books I had discovered. That's a great feeling. But at the same time, and, I think for any writer, there's always this kind of like, what if, and then like, what's the moment? Like, how do you know when the right time is? And somebody once told me, I wish I could remember who said this, but they just sort of said, look, you'll know the time to quit your day job is when you just literally can't sustain both anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't quite come true for me. But it was an interesting moment where I was getting a lot of opportunities as a writer, and I was starting to think it was maybe the time to leave. And it was kind of terrifying. I've been there, as I said, for almost 18 years. And, I mean, it's really a home away from home. I had a whole work family,
Sure.
Commuting, 4 or 5 days a week, same commute, same office, same, whatever, like,
Mm-hmm.
you just like, you've kind of built this ecosystem. And I think, but at the same time, I think that was kind of why I needed to do it, because like at some point you got to challenge yourself and break out of your rut once in a while. And yet I was worried about the economics. And,
Sure.
the other way to look at it, I guess, my friend who said, like, you'll know when you can't sustain it, like that's a very healthy, positive, smart way of looking at it. But another way of looking at it is like, well, if feel like you're almost able to do it, having, it's like jumping into the deep end. You got to swim or you're going to sink. So you're going to have more time to work on it, but you also have far more incentive to work on it. So
Right, sure.
I do think that's I think anytime you send your work out, it's a risk, because
Sure.
you're risking rejection. You're risking, you're risking the idea that like the year or two you spent writing a book is going to have been in vain. But for me, it was going full time, and
Right.
knock wood, so far so good.
So far, so good. Yeah,
Yeah.
for you. That's funny. You're the second straight. They probably won't air this way, but I had S.J. Roseanne on.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Love her.
S.J. Yeah. Oh, she was wonderful. Great episode. She'll air probably before yours, but in the recording of them, they don't come out as everyone sees them. So she was actually I think she was the very last one I recorded. It was a couple weeks back, not counting the open bar ones. That's what's throwing me off a little bit here.
Yeah.
But she had mentioned that same thing, was that a friend had said to her, like, oh, you're holding the guide rail. You don't know if you can skate yet until you go out, you shove off, and you go try to get in the middle of the rink and skate.
Yeah.
I can feel that completely, because actually, and she's funny because she had a very similar trajectory that I've been on, but she went on part-time from an architecture firm. And that's where I'm at right now is part-time. And there's that, it hits the very difficult to manage. I just mentally, like I try to get there. I'm like, this is such an easy gig. I just need to like lock in, and trying to lock in gets harder and harder. So
my wife happens to be an architect, and she's talked sometimes about like, well, I wonder if I could reduce my hours, but like the fear there is they're going to give you just as much work and pay you for the reduced hours.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and that's what it happens, right? But I mean, I got very lucky. They probably gave me less work. I'm going to have to edit this part, but
yeah. Beep.
I know, just beep out everything I'm saying from here. So, but I do like to bring something back kind of to the, sometimes they say pop culture, probably incorrectly, kind of what's next in the publishing, like kind of what's new, what's next just in the industry. And one of the big things that it's kind of all industries is the artificial intelligence. And for instance, I just read, I think I noted it in my notes here, I think they pronounce it NKit. And it's basically a self-publishing AI platform where you put in your idea, it writes book for you, and then they produce it, they generate the text, and then they want to eventually go into movies and have all AI actors and everything. So, and you had a really funny quote going back to your bio, and it will show how far we've come as a society, because this is back to your Kinkos, which was like, not enough has been written about the dangers posed to the world of literature by the ready availability of cheap photocopies.
Yeah.
And now we have AI, which is cheap photocopies on a way grander scale than you probably perceived about the time at Kinko's. What are your opinions on AI? And just, I guess in general, a open-ended kind of question.
I'm again it. Yeah, I don't think it's going to end well for our society. I don't know if it's going to actually, we're going to have the Terminators coming back from the future to kill our rebel leaders. But I don't, I think this is the classic example of tech bros getting a little ahead of themselves here.
Sure.
As a writer, obviously, I'm appalled by the idea of somebody who would use a tool like that to generate a book and then call themselves a writer, right? Put their name on it. Say, I wrote this. I have a friend who does a lot of, like generating of images using like Midjourney and stuff. And, he considers it to be a real art form, and he creates pretty amazing images, and that's cool and everything. But, I also have a son who's a really talented, 17-year-old artist who spends an immense amount of time making things by hand. And I can't help but think of like, that stuff is all built on the backs of people who slaved, people who did it on typewriters, people who did it on word processors, but people who pulled it out of their brains and put it on paper to train these large language models. And for the visual stuff, the artists or people's, other people's images. To me, it's hard to identify it as exactly as theft, but it's a form of theft. And it's also
exploitive at minimum,
it's
right?
certainly exploitative. And it's a form of intellectual laziness, and this whole, it's also, I think the writers who are going to suffer most, the writers who are already suffering are the people who used to be able to kind of break in, like writing blog posts and stuff. If you just wanted to learn how to write, you just write cheap copy and stuff, and you get paid $35 a post or whatever. But that's kind of an important apprenticeship. That stuff is definitely all going to AI. Like the next people to be hurt, I think, are going to be like the genre writers who do a lot of self-publishing on Amazon, because, there are already like guidebook creators and stuff are already getting snowed under by all this like garbage that's being created by AI and like quickly published to Amazon. And Amazon has shown that they don't really care to police it very much. It's a mess, and it's really unfortunate because of course the quality is not there. It's just not there. It's, you read the reviews on some of these AI generated things, and it's just, people are really frustrated. They've been ripped off. Right. I'm not worried terribly as a novelist that AI are going to start writing books that are going to put me out of business, because I think we're a long way off from them being able to do a credible job of that. But I do think that it just hurts the industry as a whole. And I think that for writers who want to make a living as writers, it's almost like the approach that they can make is to continue to say, like a lot of writers teach or give workshops or, speak in public or whatever. Like, it's like we have to really emphasize, the aspects of like human connection that we bring by being freaking humans and not, not a blinking cursor on your screen. But I do think is it an existential threat? Over time it will be. I don't think it is today. I think it's just disappointing how quickly people embrace this stuff. I mean, even writers I know, some of whom say, well, I don't let AI write for me, but if I'm getting stuck on a scene, I'll let AI write it and then I'll kind of revise it. And I mean, I'm honestly shocked and horrified by that. I will never use AI for anything. And I certainly wouldn't bring it into my fiction writing at all, because to me, if my name's on a book, the promise is that this comes from me, all me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
except
absolutely. For the parts I steal from better writers.
Right. Well, there's also the piece that I've always thought, and this is maybe just my misguided youthfulness, like following me up until my mid 40s now, that great art bleeds. Right. And so when I write, like, no matter what it is, I read a lot of satire. I'm working on an epic absurdist satire I actually just finished, but I worked on it for 14 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. And
that's a long book.
It is. It's going to end up being 2, but I wrote it as 1 because I wanted everything connected. I didn't want to write the series or something that, I wish I could edit. Nope. All written as 1. Maybe the dumbest and riskiest thing I've ever done, but It's here, but
It's here and it's human.
It's here and it's human. Yeah. I bled for it. I sweat for it. Like it's undeniably me.
Yeah.
So no matter what comes with it, and the idea of giving that away, for a cheap step. But what I worry about more is the noise, right? Like Amazon as far as new book discovery, Amazon's worthless, right? You have to discover them somewhere else, right? So, and because otherwise, there's low content books already. That's already been a thing where people put a book on there and there's a bunch of blank pages in it. And I worry too, just for the writers, because I think there's a lot of writers that they're hobbyists, right? Like we could go golf, and I'll go golf, and I don't golf a lot anymore, but I'd go golf with my brother or whatever. And we know we're never going to be great. We're never going to go to the PGA Tour or anything. And in fact, when you start getting with golfers that are actually kind of good, they're the ones that really understand it. Because they go, oh no, I have a 3 handicap, whatever it is, like a great handicap. They're like, no, you don't realize it's worlds away. Like, I know I'm never going to make that. I'm just proud I get to this.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think writing's great for anyone that wants to do it. But everyone started to think like, oh, I'm going to be Tiger Woods. And if only, like, this is a Tiger Woods idea. Yeah. If only, I had that break, and that break will be AI or whatever. And I think
you might be right. It's funny because that makes me think of, like, I was actually going to say this earlier, like, when you talk about not telling people you're a writer, because, the next thing is people always say, like, one thing we've all heard, right, is they say, well, I've got this great idea. I'm going to give it to you and you can write it. You could turn it into a book, because they think that, like, a book is all about the idea. Like, forget about it. Like, it's not the idea, it's the application. Right.
Yeah. Right.
But maybe those are the people who think, well, AI, I have the great idea, so now AI can just turn my great idea into a great book.
Right. Yeah. And you don't have to work for it. Right.
Yeah.
Plug it in. So
it's work.
It's a brave new world.
Very hard work. As somebody who has published, I think, over 1 million words at this point. Well, counting my freelance, for sure, I've over 1 million words.
Congratulations.
Say, write 1 million words and then you will begin to be a writer.
Right. Well, and you probably 1 million words, that's $1 a word. So you're more than a millionaire.
I am
obviously.
Totally. I didn't tell you how many years I wrote for a dime a word.
Very good. Awesome. So then let's move to our shot section here. So like I mentioned, so just rapid fire questions. Be your first thought. Don't have, you can also blather on, because that's the magic of the show. So no worries either way. But you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So in a sentence, describe your groundbreaking novel, Dark Suns. And where can our viewers get a copy?
An earnest attempt to write the great American vampire detective novel, and you cannot find a copy. If you do find a copy, mail it to me and I'll pay you to take it off the market.
Very good. And anyone that wants the background on that, you have to go watch. Go read the bio. Like I told you, I got 90% of the show. I just read a bio. That's the magic. I'm giving you the whole, like, I pull the curtain back. This is how Oz works, and it's not that impressive. Worst piece of advice you ever got?
Write what you know.
That is hilarious. I think you're the second person that's literally said that to me.
Was it SJ who said it?
Was it SJ? It might have been, because I remember hearing that recently.
I want to know if we're like secret kin here.
And he's like, SJ Roseanne, who will be, and I'll link her episode because we keep talking about it, but it might have been her. I think it might have been her that mentioned it. I'll figure it out.
Yeah, I've always believed that I believe in the corollary, which is write what you want to know more about.
Sure. No, I love that. That's awesome. Thank you for that. I'm this is supposed to be shots, but my mind is teeming, and I wanna like go off on all these directions, but that's not the bit. So we'll move on slavishly to my list. Craziest or strangest book title you encountered while working at Booklist?
Oh my God. So I used to have a shelf of self-published titles that were sent to us for a review, which we often couldn't review because they didn't have distribution. Like this is killing me. I can't remember the name of this. Can I tell you the craziest book I encountered working at Booklist? I don't remember the title, but okay. So the craziest book. This was sent to us for review. Remember, listeners, once again, that we were a book review for public librarians to decide on what books to purchase for the shelves of your public library. And somebody sent us a 30-page handwritten book about archery with stick figure illustrations. And I mean, the idea... it was words fail me. Obviously, they're failing me right now. But the idea that we can't review it because nobody can buy it because it's handwritten. What are you going to do? I think they might have thought we were a publisher. They might have been laboring under misapprehension. But of all the crazy ass books we received over the years, that was the one that I just wish I could remember the title. I don't know how crazy it was, but I think it was a weird title too.
That's funny. That's funny. If you remember, let me know. I'll post it on the bottom of the screen if anyone watching on the YouTube box. But
I hope
that's
it comes
hilarious. Anonymous reviews: the guillotine or the stocks?
I think they're the stocks. Yeah.
The stocks? Okay. Yeah. Well, you have some mercy there. I like to see that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
you saved the cat just now.
Well, the thing is that they're, anonymous, it's going to be a it's that there's a reason they're writing it anonymously. But at the same time, if they took time to read the book and to write something about it, I mean, the stock can still be in hot sun, right? I mean, it can still be a pretty miserable experience.
Sure. Very true. Yeah. Very true. It's funny. I went, when I first conceived of, well, I think I always had the notion of wanting to write full time, right? But I had kids very young, and life happens, and you need to work that life the best you can. And when I was transitioning to now part time, and perhaps at some later stage full time, I had the notion I wanted to be a great writer, but I had no notion. And this is the corporate, so people put corporate down, but there's a lot of stuff it can teach you. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that had taught me, so I was a director of, and that's technically still my title, director of quality regulatory, is that people will work to what they're measured towards, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm I want to be a great writer. What does that mean? Yeah. And I started thinking, how do I actually measure that, in some way? And one of the things I thought with that was, great doesn't mean safe. So I actually want to get some negative reviews. If I'm getting none, then am I really challenging anything? Am I really achieving greatness? Yeah. And so I look at them very positively, occasionally, and I don't have tons of reviews as it is, but probably a couple hundreds, in the range of hundreds total. But the few that are negative at times, I'm okay. That's what I want to see. And I look at it positively for me. So. Well, I would still do guillotine because I'm medieval,
It's similar to what I always tell aspiring authors about rejection is value rejection, because it means that you made yourself vulnerable and you put yourself out into the world. So, you can, I think, count your rejections as a badge of pride, because every rejection means that you tried again. Sure. Somebody with no rejection never tried. And even bad reviews mean you at least have readers, right?
Right, absolutely. And I used to do it, and then we'll get back to the shots, but I used to do it there used to be the self-addressed stamped envelope. Yeah. That now it's all internet based, but you would get your short story, which was what I was submitting at the time, back, and they'd give you a little, usually form. Sometimes they'd write you a little note why they rejected it and give you some kind words. But I had a nice stack of those. And I used to show those to the kids. That's all my rejections. So you think, oh, you won this award or whatever. But look, that's all the rejections that got me there eventually. So I think it's a little harder sometimes than the internet, where it's ethereal rejections.
or they ignore you.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You just never know. Travel that changed your life.
Well, after college, I went to London and I worked in a bookstore on Charing Cross Road, and hanging out with quick-witted, literate Brits in the Angel pub about 50 yards from work, night after night, was absolutely life-changing. I mean, I was always a little bit of a lame Anglophile, like as a young reader, but absolutely life-changing just to spend, any time abroad, but also to be working in a bookstore. Famous authors came in and we did events with them. And, Gore Vidal came in to do an event at work while I was there. And I'm thinking, like, Gore Vidal is a pretty famous writer, right? Well, he was there. He wasn't doing a conversation. He was there to sign books for 1 hour. And there was a line, but after 20 minutes, he had signed all the books and there was no more line. And so here's this famous guy sitting alone at the table. And my manager said, go grab a couple of books off the shelf and pretend you're a fan. And that was really instructive to me, that, like, no matter how much success you've had, you might find yourself alone in a bookstore with an employee pretending to be a fan to sign your books. And he was a pro. He was very gracious, uncomplaining, and all that. But that was instructive.
Sure. That's awesome. That's a lovely story. Most romantic animal, bats or mourning doves?
Bats. When I proposed marriage to my wife, we were in Austin, Texas, lying on the banks of the river, watching the bats fly out from underneath the Congress Street Bridge. And so bats are kind of a spirit animal for us.
Very good. It's funny. I had on my old professor. I've never been the mentor type, but I had one professor back in junior college, like a billion years ago, that he's written me little blurbs for my books and things now. And we've somewhat kept in contact, but I was like, I wanted to wait to have him on the show until I had built up some kind of audience and I could give something back. Yeah. And so I had him on, naturalist, Charles Hood. Your episode would probably be before his, I think, how the timeline goes. But he was mentioning where I like to ride my bike out here. There's this certain times of the year, there's like 2,000 bats. And I'm like, what do you mean? I don't like these bats are going to attack me. And they're insectivores or whatever, so they're going to eat the bugs. But I'm gonna go watch those bats. I'm pretty excited about it now. So I can see that. I can actually see watching them. Being
they're
romantic
fascinating
in this way too.
Yeah. I love to watch bats in the dusk. It's great.
Very good. So better detective, Gadget or Holmes?
I'm going to go with Holmes. I'm going to take the traditional, easy, obvious answer there.
I mean, Inspector Gadget, though, all those gadgets we had Penny and the dog, like, helping. There's a lot.
There's an argument. There's an argument, I'll say.
And if this podcast and both of us were to self-destruct in 10 seconds, what is the message you'd leave? 10, 9, 8.
Don't give up, even if you only have 10 seconds left. You might sell that book.
Very good. Very good. Thank you for that. So that'll conclude our shots for today. Thanks for playing along with that. So are you ready to read something for us?
I will do my best. Yeah, I'll keep it pretty quick. After a couple of high proof cocktails, we'll see how well I do.
Very good.
So this is just a couple pages from The Royal Game, the new Linda Keir novel. And instead of doing the usual thing and setting it up, I'm going to read it and then set it up.
Very cool.
That makes sense.
That's perfect.
Okay, so this is chapter 10, Take Note of Your Surroundings. The black bag over her head was loose, but Jenny still found it hard to breathe. As the car hurtled down the road, she took deeper and deeper breaths, trying to draw in more air and convince herself she wouldn't run out. The men had spoken only simple commands after they suddenly appeared as she stepped out of the little shop onto the sidewalk. Now that she was tightly wedged between the two of them in the back seat, they weren't speaking at all. She could feel their bodies on high alert, just as she could feel the car rising and falling as they raced along at what felt like 100 miles per hour. She tried telling herself it was somehow better not to see, to take comfort in her cocoon of darkness, but it didn't work. For all she knew, they could be headed straight for a brick wall. Jenny tried to remember her training. It had gone by so quickly, and so much of it seemed to stress not doing anything. If escape is not immediately possible, follow your captor's commands and do not physically resist or antagonize them. There was no way she could take note of your surroundings. Humanize yourself, one of the instructors had repeatedly stressed. But how exactly was she supposed to do that? It was like a question in a college philosophy class she would have dropped once the boys started arguing with each other about artificial intelligence. My name is Jenny Jensen, she said, her voice strange to her own ears. I'm 27 years old and I'm from Illinois in the United States. One of the men grunted in response. Then the car began a sweeping turn, lifting on its suspension. Her stomach dropped. She needed to steady herself, but with her hands zip tied in front of her and fastened to a longer tie that went around her waist, all she could do was bobble helplessly. I'm adopted, she chanted, spitting out fabric after a fold of the bag entered her mouth, which I've always known, but most people didn't realize because I kind of looked like my parents anyway. The car went over a small hill, and she could tell it had left the ground because of how hard it hit when they landed. Suddenly, she was on the verge of tears. Someone who's kidnapping you didn't care that you were human. Your humanness was what made you vulnerable. My fiancé will be worried about me, she choked out. Keep your mouth shut, barked the driver. Jenny reached out for a happy memory, one from before the world knew about their romance, and it was still their special secret, when she was still safe. Botswana, Hugh leading her out of the tent, a five-star hotel room with a canvas ceiling, to a jeep, driving her through a green-fringed, the Makadgiti salt pans, the sun-baked and stunningly flat remains of an inland sea. Not at all her stereotype of an African safari with birds and animals flocking to a watering hole. Apart from the jeep full of armed bodyguards that parked at a discreet distance, it was just the two of them at the edge of nowhere with 2 chairs, a picnic basket, and a bottle of champagne to savor as the sun went down. Hugh saying, I love you, Jenny. Heat rising from the earth, their glasses sparkling in the red light. I love you too. She grabbed the memory tightly and held on. If she was going to die, she would want to remember that. Hugh's face, kissing him. Tires squealed as the driver braked and skidded into a turn. Jenny heard sirens in the distance and the low thud of a helicopter. They were coming to rescue her. Suddenly, wind whipped through the car. The men had lowered their windows. The pressure on both sides eased as they shifted their bodies and turned away from her and began firing at the pursuers. Her ears were stung by the gunshots, but she couldn't raise her hands to cover them. Engines whined as the pursuit vehicles drew closer. Commands were barked through a bullhorn and carried away on the wind. In the darkness, Jenny pressed her eyes tightly shut. She bounced back and forth as the car swerved, left the road, and bumped wildly over grass before reversing direction on pavement again. The men reloaded and kept firing, and the rescuers shot back. Jenny hoped they were aiming for the tires. Then there was an impossibly loud bang, then another, and another as the car fishtailed, bounced, and came to a halt. Shit, 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 she heard herself screaming in terror. The doors flew open, and she could feel the men bailing out. She pictured them crouching behind open doors as the gunfire rattled like a Midwestern hailstorm on the metal roof of the patio of the house where she grew up. Then it trickled to a stop. In the brief moment of silence, Jenny felt as alone as she had ever felt in her life. Boots clomped on the road as shouting men ran to the car. Hands gripped her and pulled her out, helping her upright. Her legs were cut free, then her hands. Then finally the bag came off, leaving her blinking in the bright gray light of a late spring day, surrounded by smiling SAS commandos. We've got you, Princess, said the nearest one, who was rocking a retro pencil-thin mustache. I'm not Princess yet, she told him after she'd caught her breath. He winked. That's Princess with a small p. Her knees were suddenly so wobbly she could hardly stand up. Cup of tea? So I don't do British accents. on Zoom anyway. I will do them privately, but I don't want to have them recorded. But so that what this scene is it's a little bit of a we're duping the reader a little bit. We're opening the chapter as though Jenny has been abducted, but actually this is training that royals have to go through. In real life, Princess Diana went through this training and famously had a very near miss when a flashbang grenade caught her hair on fire. So the training is very intense and very real and very scary. And so we wanted to immerse the reader in that by having Jenny Jensen, who's our American princess to be, going through this training as she's engaged to Prince Hugh and about to become a member of the royal family.
Right. That's awesome. You know what I loved about it was that so often we get very preoccupied with the visual.
Yeah.
So when you throw the hood on someone and you get that, and then with reading, it works out so well anyways, because you're not looking at what they're seeing anyways. So you get that visceral quality of it. So.
And that's like those fun writing challenges I was talking about, right? You limit yourself, like take something out of it and then see what you can do.
Sure. That's lovely. Thank you so much for that. And I had no idea. I didn't know that they actually went through the training. So
yeah,
that's even interesting. And like you were saying, sometimes the research is part of the joy, like figuring out what weird stuff is going on,
and gives you good ideas for chapters.
Very good. Yeah. Awesome. So thanks so much for that. So I like to say it's last call. You don't have to go, but you'll have to restart the video. And what I like to end every episode with is just what's one piece of advice you'd give to the general reader, not necessarily the writer viewer, but just anyone watching today. What's one small thing they can do just to make their life a little bit better?
Oh, great. I think one of the best things you can do to make your life better is to read before bed instead of watching TV until you fall asleep. You'll sleep better and you'll read more.
Right. No, I believe that completely. Actually, guess what? They talk about like the blue light with TV and things.
Oh, yeah.
Can get to you. And everyone, it sounds self-serving when you're a writer and you say it. I know, I mean, I'm a writer and I host a writer-themed podcast. I should read more. I'm a very slow. I don't put any goals because I really chew on what I'm reading, so I take my sweet time with it. But I can see that there's times when I'm purposely reading something, I do it and I really love it. At the end of the night, gets your imagination going, you dream well, you don't have the TV on. And
always sleep better if you read before bed instead of watch TV. Yeah. It's as somebody who's struggled with insomnia at different times in my life. I mean, that's a major part of the cure.
Right. Yeah, I believe it. And so if people want to learn more about you, I mean, obviously we have the website. Is there anywhere else we should direct them to?
Yes, absolutely. I would strongly encourage anybody who's enjoyed this conversation and wants to hear from me on a regular basis to subscribe to my newsletter, Graff Paper, which can be found at keirgraff.com. That's keirgraff.com/newsletter. So it's right there on my website, very easy to find. It is once a month, the second Tuesday of every month at 2 p.m. Central. I will not share anybody's email address with anybody else. I don't, ever intend to write more than once a month. I think that nobody needs to hear from a writer 3 times a week necessarily. And, I really try not to, kind of in the spirit of what we were talking about early in the podcast, it's not all about me marketing myself. I mean, if I have a new book out, I'm definitely going to talk about that. But it's essays. I write about writing, publishing, life in general, whatever random thing. I ran a marathon. I wrote about that. But mostly writing and publishing. But I try to not be marketing myself, but I try to make a connection. Sure. It's been one of the most rewarding things I do.
Right. Absolutely. I think that's, not to get back to the advice, that's also for the writers. That's lovely advice. Just you can think you need to be marketing all the time. And really what you need to be is making connections, all the time. So I think that's a lovely way to do that. So, 100%. So awesome. And I'll include, so I already have the website ready to put in there. And I believe when I clicked on the website, it was one of the first things that popped up.
Should be.
Awesome. So anyone watching, if you go down the description, if you happen on my website, it'll be in just the main area where you watch the video. You can click on that and get right in to put the website in or the email in, and get that. So thanks again so much for coming on. This is a real honor. I told you before, it's a labor of fun. It really is. I love everyone. I tend to run long just because I have so much fun. So thanks so much for
the
staying
time
on
has flown. I can't believe it's as late as it is, but no, it's been an absolute pleasure. I really, really thank you for having me on. And I hope that viewers and listeners enjoy this as much as I did. This was just a terrific conversation.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. And I poured myself just a glass of that rye I had earlier because I finished the drink that we made together. Remember the Maine. So I remember the Maine this time. Yeah. See, I have grown a little bit from this conversation. That might have been the little bit that I've gotten, but I remembered something. So cheers so much. Thanks for coming on again.
Here, let me pour just a little sip here so I can give you a nice toast here. I ran out of cocktail as well, but just
no worries. And then when you do have, I know you were working on the podcast. So when you have the podcast up and going, let me know. Even if it's after the show aired, I can always update the description. So
I think we're going to announce actually and launch in 2 weeks. So
perfect. It should be there for sure.
Yeah.
So let me know. So I'll be happy to support you on the podcast as well.
Thank you so much.
Cheers,
my friend. Sir.
Thanks for tuning in. The show is labor of fun, and it's truly a reward in its own right. But if you would like to support me or the other amazing authors I have on there, consider picking up a book. Any of the writers we have on here would be a great addition to your bookshelf. Each one is a master storyteller and just a great person to boot, so you'd be doing them and yourself a great favor in picking those up. And while I would never call myself a master, because that would be, as we said in the 90s, conceited, I do have on a pretty good authority from critics and my mom alike that I'm not bad. So if you wouldn't mind picking up one of my books, that would be great as well. I would appreciate it. Thanks again for watching, and thanks to my great panel of guests for coming on and spending this time with us. Cheers.